Hey, what's going on?
Bastiat, my man. How are you?
Doing pretty good. Do you? It looks like you got the second camera working. You want me to? I can drop in with mine then.
I don't know if I do actually. I don't think it
No,
is
they're
working.
no, they're. I see them both. I mean, I see the one up close and then the one in the corner. But up to you.
No, that's the one that I'm actually using both of them on my stream. So that's why I was
Oh,
like,
okay. All right.
since I'm using both on my stream, I actually won't be able to use it in Discord.
Okay, no worries.
If you're cool with
All
it.
right. So, yeah, how are you doing tonight?
Fantastic, man. I'm loving the hype that we built up on this UBI debate. It's gonna get real.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, definitely. So when did you first hear about the idea of a universal basic income?
Oh, I probably heard about it in college, taking
Mm-hmm.
economics courses and stuff like that. But
Mm-hmm.
um, the only thing recently that that has made any news whatsoever is obviously Yang's proposal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm
Yeah.
assuming that. I mean, do you consider yourself a Yang supporter?
Yeah. Although I wouldn't say that his is like the only way to do it. But yeah, I would say I'm definitely a supporter of Andrew Yang.
Okay. So,
So
but are you like gonna defend everything that Andrew Yang has proposed?
I would defend most of it. I mean, there are some points that I would there are some points that I would take some issue with, but in general, like the broad outline of it, yeah, I would defend that.
Okay.
The $1,000 a month to every American over 18 who is not in prison. Basically that's his UBI.
Really? So he
Um,
does make a distinction. He does make a distinction for people in prison, huh?
Yeah, if you're in prison, you don't get it, but as soon as you get back out of prison, then you get it again. So that's the one class of people who does not get a universal basic income here. By the way, we're going to have some
Wow.
serious streamception going on here with this because I put this in the
Yeah, we
corner
do.
of my stream, so that should be fun.
Yeah, I'm gonna make this. There we go.
Okay,
So,
all right.
dude, so giving $1,000 a month to an 18-year-old, that is insane, dude. You know how much money that is for like a high schooler? And
Oh yeah,
why
sure.
would a high schooler need $1,000 a month?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, the same reason that any adult needs any money. I mean, they could use that money for whatever purposes they'd use it for, the same as anybody who comes into an inheritance could use that money for. It's kind of like a socially guaranteed form of inheritance rather than, say the way that inheritances work now, where only those who are blessed enough to have rich relatives get them. So, I mean, I don't think it's a particularly crazy idea to give young people money. I mean, they're adults at that point in time. So whether they're
Okay,
18 or 80,
but like, dude, the prefrontal cortex isn't even fully developed until 25. Like, these people are gonna,
Mm,
they're not gonna be making smart decisions. And to characterize it as an inheritance is almost as bad as actually characterizing it as a dividend. It's
I don't.
the last thing it is a dividend
Mm.
or an inheritance. It's
Why would you?
neither of
Well,
those.
all right. There are 2 points there, so let's get these one at a time. The first point you made, I really want to push back on the idea that somebody who's 18 is not capable of making good decisions. People who are 18 years old are capable of making the ultimate decision, which is to serve our country in the military, right? In fact, I think you can make that decision when you're 17 if you have your parents' consent. So the idea that 18-year-olds cannot make decisions, good decisions, I mean, if that's the case, we've got to do some serious restructuring of our society. Because right now, 18-year-olds can make some very critical life decisions. So, I mean, I really want to push back on that. If adulthood means something, it means something. But the argument you just made about that, I mean, that seems to me an argument to say, all right, well, maybe we should push the age of adulthood up. But that's a separate issue. I mean, either
Well,
adulthood means something or it
mean,
doesn't.
doesn't Andrew Yang actually isn't he in favor of making the voting age 16?
Yeah, that's one of his ideas. I mean, and which I think is reasonable too. But I mean, that's a separate issue. Again, I would say that if you did want to push the age of adulthood down to like 16, I mean, fine, then UBI would start at 16.
Well, I
But I
mean,
think that either way, adulthood should like mean something. Either you have the full range of choices available to you or you don't.
no, I
You
mean,
know.
I agree with adulthood being 18 and you should be
Mm-hmm.
get your full range of choices, which is why I think handgun laws that
Mm-hmm.
make it 21 to get a handgun,
Yeah.
and I think drinking age 21. I think all of those should
Yeah.
be lowered to 18. So I generally agree. But dude, just like the idea of giving $1,000 a month to a high
Mm-hmm.
schooler or a college kid, like that money is gonna be
Mm-hmm.
just blown on just
Well,
worthless stuff.
I don't know why I mean I really don't know why he can come to that conclusion so assertively. Like I mean, we know, I mean I'm sure we both knew 18-year-olds who in high school were shiftless and probably would have blown that money. But I mean, I also knew people who were incredibly driven, even that young in life, who, probably would use that money to start businesses, to get a leg up on their education. I mean, to improve themselves. So I think the idea that just any 18-year-old would blow it, I don't subscribe to that.
All right. Well, fair enough. I mean, that honestly, it's not the main reason I'm against it, but the main reason that we won't even go there. Let's just start take this slower. It's not a dividend. It's not a dividend or an inheritance. Like a dividend is something that is distributed by a company from excess profits to shareholders. An inheritance is something that you get from a person who has devised money that they've earned to you. This UBI is a giveaway of somebody else's money who doesn't want to give it to you, being forced at the point of the government. It's not a dividend. It's not an inheritance. It's the opposite of freedom. And it's basically just bribery dressed up as socialism.
Right. I get what you're going at with there. Now, if you want to say that the branding is inaccurate, I mean, you might be able to say that the term freedom dividend is an accurate branding by the textual definition of the word branding. But I mean, the idea behind it is it calls on us to think about, being citizens of a country in more of a sense than I guess even I would traditionally want to, right? Like I as much as I'm proud of the United States, I feel like, we all should have individual freedom up to the maximum, in such a way that comports with law and order. But the idea of calling it a freedom dividend is to, I guess, say that, as citizens of the United States, we should feel a sense of unity with one another. We all contribute to this country. And because of all the massive prosperity we have as a country, some of that should come back to us, just by virtue of our being kind of citizens in this enterprise, the United States, somewhat analogous to shareholders in a company. I mean, that's one way to think about it. If you don't accept it, I mean, that's fine. But I guess that's not really critical to the, to the policy program itself.
I mean, the reason that I don't accept that is because the premise is that the U.S. has got just a big pot of money and the U.S. is super rich and we've got all this money. It's like, dude, we're $23 trillion in debt. You know how much that is per taxpayer? That's like $187,000 in debt. Like we're broke, dude. Every individual taxpayer owes $187,000, and that's just federal debt. That's not even state and local debt or individual consumer debt, anything like that. And so the idea that we're entitled to just free cash from working people because we're citizens of the United States and that it's a dividend and that we're shareholders in the United States is preposterous because we're freaking broke. We're in debt. There's no pot of money. There's nowhere this money is going to come from.
Well, I mean, now you could argue with the terminology of it, if you'd like. And I mean, again, that's fine. I mean, that's a perspective issue. But the argument you made on top of that, where you just said, there's not a pile of money somewhere that we're waiting to have, right, that we're waiting to tap into. I mean, first of all, UBI would not be funded through any kind of money printing. It would be funded through the creation of some kind of new tax, like ideally a value-added tax that would be charged as a flat tax on all purchases, right? So it would not be funded through either going into deeper debt or printing money. It would be funded through the receipts of this tax. And that tax, I mean, you could argue with it on whatever basis you might choose, but the way that at least Andrew Yang's plan has it laid out, it's a 20% tax on all goods, and 80% of Americans are better off with the tax and the UBI than they would be, than they would have been before, right? So it is a redistributive program, but it's a just a direct cash transfer that is certainly much less bureaucratic than, for example, some of the programs it would replace, like food stamps, like the WIC program, the TANF program. These programs which require the creation of massive bureaucracies to oversee and control the lives of individual Americans, rather than just a simple transfer of cash that achieves the same goals much more effectively and without the same kind of controls over individual decisions.
Okay, there's so many problems with that. First of all, the idea that you're going to create economic growth by taking money from one person through these various taxes and giving it to another is like saying that you're going to do a blood transfusion from your right arm to your left arm and spill a bunch of blood on the floor, and you're going to come out ahead. You're going to come out ahead there because and the blood being spilled on the floor is essentially the administrative costs of collecting the taxes and distributing this money. Second of all, Andrew Yang's not proposing the elimination of all these massive welfare programs. He's actually saying that this is on top of our existing welfare bureaucracy. And I know he says, well, you'll get the choice. You'll either get to participate in all of these welfare programs or you'll get the $1,000 a month. And he's actually proposing a substantial increase in the welfare. He's saying free preschool, massive increase in teacher salaries, money for vocational training, billions of dollars for climate change, bunch of money for subsidized moving costs, democracy dollars, $100 a year to give to your political candidates, prosperity grants of $100 to give to a charity, which is an absurd idea because it's not charity if you're giving away somebody else's money. So, like, the whole point of like Milton Friedman's idea of a negative income tax, which has been tried and failed in the U.S., but that idea
was
actually
not tried. It was not tried. It was put before Congress, but it wasn't tried.
Well,
I mean, nobody ever got to try it.
It was tried. It was tried in like certain like 4 different cities.
It was.
Like Denver.
I don't mean to throw you off. We can address that.
I'm going to
set the precedent of interrupting you here.
No, that's fine. The main point is that like if Andrew Yang was actually saying, I'm going to get rid of every single welfare program in the country, I'm going to get rid of federal funding of student loans, I'm going to get rid of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, I'm going to get rid of the minimum wage, I'm going to get rid of all of these labor regulations, then your argument would actually make sense. But when you're proposing the UBI on top of and in an expansion of all of the existing welfare programs, we don't have the money for it, and it's not going to create any economic growth. Like just pumping money from one person into another person is not going to create economic growth, especially when his tax proposals are going to do substantial damage to the economy. This national sales tax, the VAT tax, eliminating the cap on Social Security, massively increasing capital gains, the financial transaction tax, which is also what Elizabeth Warren wants to use to fund Medicare for all. All of these things would dramatically reduce economic growth in this country. And so you're going to basically harm the economy to try to pump blood from one arm to the other arm. And you think that's going to, provide some benefit when you're not even actually getting the positive sides of UBI, which would require elimination of all the welfare and the minimum wage.
So I reject the premise that the perfect has to be the enemy of the good. Now, you're right. Milton Friedman's ideal was that all of the programs would be eliminated and replaced by the single negative income tax. I'm certainly open to the negative income tax as an alternative to UBI. A negative income tax would be more affordable and would accomplish some of the same goals, although it lacks the universality that I think makes the UBI program, which would make it most popular. But that being said, the perfect doesn't have to be the enemy of the good, right? Now, UBI would come, the Yang plan, which of course is not the only way to do it, but his plan is that it wouldn't replace disability, it wouldn't replace Social Security, and it wouldn't replace a future universal healthcare program. What it would replace are more, other cash-based programs like food stamps, WIC, and then other forms of direct cash assistance to needy people. It would replace those, which you can lose based on changes in your life circumstances or based on determinations that you're no longer eligible, or because you just run out of, you run out of funds if the state limits it in some way. It would replace those with the $1,000 a month guarantee, freeing those people up from the issue of having to worry about eligibility, from the threat of losing the benefits if they improve their lives in some way. If they get a job, they might, for example, not be able to get these cash payments if they try and improve their lives in some way, and they run the risk, therefore, of falling into this welfare trap where they're always stuck on these benefits because they worry that any attempt to improve their lives will throw them off and put them at risk of being worse off than they were before. So that's one point I want to push back on, is the idea that you can't make some progress in eliminating some bureaucracy. I would say that you can't. I don't think you could ever get rid of, say, the government's role in the health system, in terms of disability. I think those programs are here to stay. Social Security, again. But you could still push back on some government bureaucracy. You could still roll back some government bureaucracy. And I think probably those programs, especially those that target assistance to certain types of families, are probably some of the most pernicious in terms of how they, directly impact people's decision making. I mean, these are the programs that I know conservatives often rail against, like the WIC program, right? Aid to women's and infant children. those programs, arguably, gosh, I'm not sure if this is still true, but I know up until very recently, there was that whole argument that this program undermines the family by incentivizing people to get a divorce, because in some circumstances they can get a raise for being single, for not having a provider in the household. So this program ends all those perverse incentives by just giving you a direct cash transfer that you don't lose unless you go to prison. That's the one circumstance in which you lose it. So that's one advantage there. That's one point I want to push back on. The other point is you said that it was tried and failed. Now, as far as I know, if we're looking at the same 4 city studies in the United States, and I don't remember all the names of the cities involved, but there were 4 of them, and there were also studies in Canada and some other studies overseas. But if we just focus on the ones in the United States, the only negative outcome I saw, well, there were 2. One, there was a slight decrease in productivity among 2 groups. Women who had just given birth to children, who were able to spend more time at home with their families, and young men who were able to avoid having to forego their education to take care of their families. So there was some decrease in productivity there. Arguably 2 groups that we don't mind that there's some decrease in productivity, but otherwise the only negative effect was, at the time, this claim that it drove divorce rates up. Now that was proven to be untrue. But when you said that the program failed, the reason it was voted down in the 70s was it became somewhat politically toxic after this idea came out that it would drive an increase in the divorce rate. And frankly, even if that were true, that doesn't seem like a problem to me if really what it means is people who now have economic independence are able to leave partners who I guess they were only with because they were economically dependent on. So, I mean, the idea that it hasn't worked when it's been tested, I mean, you could say that we need to do more tests because, of course, these were tests, in the somewhat distant past in the 1970s. But the idea that it didn't work, I would definitely push back on that.
Okay, well, so the reasons that I say it didn't work is because it resulted in a drop in working hours, and also prolonged unemployment, and that makes perfect sense why it did that. And there's a study that I can cite if you're one of these people that only believe something if you cite a study.
I'll take your word for it. I mean, while we're going forward, I mean, I don't mind taking your word for it as long as you don't mind me saying, well, I disagree with that, but we can assume your argument for the sake of a hypothetical. We don't have to get into that.
Right. Well, and it makes perfect sense because if you're all of a sudden you're getting $1,000 a month or whatever it is, and okay, well, I could be working 40 hours a week and I could make another $5,000, say, or I could work 30 hours a week and make $4,000 and I'll get the $1,000 from the government. And so it makes perfect sense that you would actually result in fewer hours being worked. And then it also makes sense that it would actually prolong unemployment. So if you're working and boom, you go unemployed, you lose your job. Now, all of a sudden, you've got just free money coming in from the government, which, of course, it's not free because your neighbor's paying for it, which is immoral in and of itself. But you're gonna stay unemployed longer. So it has substantial negative effects on people. And frankly, like, jobs are an important part of being a human and being a man, and one of the most fulfilling aspects of humanity and being a real man is actually providing for yourself and making something of it. And so this actually robs people of one of the most fulfilling aspects of life, which is providing for themselves. And so the negative impacts on, and so when I say it failed, and like I've read the Huffington Post articles that are talking about how, oh, it's a success because it showed people reported more happiness. And it's like, that, like, you can certainly point to like 1 or 2 things where you could say, oh, it was a benefit or whatever, and it's like if you actually look at the hard data. All
right. Well, look, I again, I mean, I'm not disputing the hard data here, but I mean, well, I am disputing your read on the hard data. I do dispute what you're saying, where basically the only positive was happiness. I mean, even if that were true, I mean, and nothing else was really worse, that's a huge benefit. Like you said, for example, the idea that people were unemployed longer. Well, generally, the idea is that people are unemployed longer. And of course, those same people have the same ideas you do about jobs being fulfilling. And the fact is that 12K is not enough to replace a job. I mean, you still need a job with a universal basic income. I mean, so, yeah, it's just enough to take the edges off of, the risk of losing your job or being, in some kind of desperation. But those people still need jobs, but they are now able to hold out a little longer, maybe to find a more fulfilling, more ideal job that better fits their skill set. I mean, a lot of the, one problem we have in this country is the idea of underemployment, where you're employed in a task in which you don't fit, where you could maybe be put to more efficient purposes. So UBI does give you more condition, or rather more cushion, to wait for that more better job fit for you. So I mean, I don't view that as necessarily a problem. I think that's arguably a good thing. But I do want to push back on a point that you made there. Well, 2 points. One, the idea that happiness is not really, I mean, are you saying that happiness is not really a legitimate, government purpose?
No, I question these studies where it's like, and people cite these studies all the time for European style socialism. It's like where they do a poll and they say, how happy are you, 1 through 10? And then people report it. And it's like, I don't think those are necessarily reliable, and people often don't know really what's like whether they're really happy. I think the better way to look at it is through other statistics like drug and alcohol abuse, divorce rates, numbers of prescription anxiety medications and depression medications, rates of things like that. And if you look at those kind of statistics, they often contradict what people are self-reporting. But the whole point is that that's like literally the like, and so I mean, you have the government, you have the government give you $1,000 a month. Of course you're,
I mean, those studies, like, I'm not sure why those studies would be like inherently less valuable here. I mean, at a certain point, I don't like those studies either, in a sense, because they always rank the United States as middling to the lower end of happiness among developed countries. But I mean, at a certain point, there are so many of these floating out there, so many people self-reporting in these countries with different systems that they're happier, that maybe at a certain point, it's worth considering whether they've got something to think about.
Well, I mean, I don't think
the
so.
United States never comes on top on these, I mean, and it's always the same kind of countries that do.
Right. So, I mean, the thing is like if you're getting a bunch of free stuff from the government, and then somebody calls you up and says, "Hey, like, are you happy?" Of course, you're gonna be like, "Yeah, I got a free bunch of stuff from the government." But then when you compare that against the actual impacts of it, including longer periods of unemployment, overall reduction in job growth, loss of economic growth, the fundamental unfairness of having the government take money from somebody and give it to somebody else, like that entire premise is completely unfair.
Right. So you mentioned morality here, right? And I have to ask you, how is there any moral distinction here between what we're already doing, where we are taking money and giving it to other people for basically every single program the federal government runs? I mean, you can argue that some of these programs are necessary. Some of them are proper, but certainly there are cases where that's not the case and where there's wide disagreement on that. I mean, for example, some of the wars that the United States has been involved in the last 20 years cost trillions of dollars, huge opposition to them, and yet they were certainly all funded by the taxpayer, and of course by also printing money. And the idea, I think if you're going to push back on this idea in a moral sense, I think what you're pushing back on is the idea that any government expenditure through taxation is moral. So I mean, how do you make a distinction that some are moral and some are not?
Easy. Like you have to figure out what's the purpose of government, what's its proper role. I mean, I reject all of these federal government welfare programs, period. And I'm not opposed to a state doing some of these things. For example, like a true disability program at the state level, like I'm not going to be opposed to that. But the federal government in Washington, D.C. is a government of enumerated powers, very specific enumerated powers. It's supposed to provide for the common defense. It's supposed to do post offices and postal roads. It's supposed to make bankruptcy laws. It's supposed to control immigration. It's supposed to coin money. Like there's a very few limited things. And so when I say it's immoral to take money from somebody and give it to somebody else, That is specifically applying to a federal government welfare program where they're literally just taking money from one citizen and then giving it to another citizen. That's completely different than the government taking money and then providing for the common defense. There's nothing immoral about taxing me and then using that money to provide national security for me. That's completely different than taking money from me and then giving it to somebody else.
First of all, in terms of funding any government program, however legitimate you might view it under the Constitution, you are taking money from me to give to some other person who I guess is then going to provide a service that we all, or at least that many of us agree, is socially useful. Right now, I mean, you're still taking money and giving it to other people. There's a whole class of defense contractors out there who are rich with billions of dollars because the federal government takes from us to give to them. So the idea that a transfer from one person to another is somehow immoral or is not already existing in our current system. I mean, the difference here, I think it's important to highlight. This isn't a moral question. This isn't a moral difference. This is a difference of pragmatism. I mean, certainly the Constitution itself, it's not a document of morality. It's a document of policy. It's a document of legality. But the moral question of taking from one to give to another, I mean, you can disagree with the merits, but I don't think you can say that one form of giving to another is somehow immoral. I mean, because at the end of the day, I'm being taken from either way.
Like, you're really going to make it so you think the purpose and who's it's going to and what it's being used for makes no impact on whether it's moral or not. I think that's preposterous. Like, of course, the purpose behind the government taxing and spending it is relevant to whether it's moral or not. And so the idea, like, so you're saying every single time the government taxes and spends money, it has equal moral worth regardless of what it's used for, regardless of the point of it. That's a very unnuanced, way overgeneralizing statement.
I would not say that it's always the same, but I think the idea that because it's not enumerated specifically in the Constitution, and again, I think that the Commerce Clause well justifies all of these welfare programs the same way as it would justify UBI. And certainly, while I would recognize that you may disagree that any of these programs are constitutional, I mean, UBI is at least as constitutional as any of them that already exist.
Well,
so I don't think there's. I see you may be pushing back on the idea that any of them are constitutional. I disagree on that point.
Okay, so you think Wickard v. Filburn was rightly decided?
Not necessarily. Let me check that.
Okay, Wickard v. Filburn was the one where there was a guy growing grain.
Yeah, the wheat one. Yeah,
he was literally growing it for himself and keeping it on his own farm, and that's interstate commerce.
Yes. Yeah, that was the federal government taking the decision to make serious inroads on the economic activity that somebody can engage in, rather than just saying you can tax to one to give to another. I mean, that's a whole different point there. So yeah, Wickard v. Filburn in that respect was certainly wrong. The idea that you have to limit the economic activity of some people to make the whole system work, I mean, that feeds into the whole destructive program of agriculture subsidies that we've got in the United States, agriculture controls, and yeah, I mean, that's a problem. But I mean, I don't think that case is what I don't think you have to come to that conclusion to say therefore it's right, and proper, or it's at least proper and legal for the federal government to engage in taxation to then distribute to others.
Okay, so let me ask you this then: if the government taxes from you and it spends that on building a post office and a postal road, do you think that is just as moral as the government taking that money from you and using it to commit, let's say, war crimes?
Yeah, no. So the point you made, yeah, I would agree. That is a moral distinction.
Okay, so you do admit that there is a distinction.
The distinction there is not based on the fact that one is clearly spelled out in the Constitution and the other is not. Like, I mean, I guess both arguably are spelled out. The Constitution permits the military specifically and the post office specifically, but that doesn't mean that like they're both that the morality depends on why one is in the Constitution or not. I mean, the morality is based on the act itself.
No, I agree, but I'm saying that UBI is immoral regardless of the Constitution, and so I do think the Constitution. I mean, dude, morality, the basis of all of our laws is morality, and that's how it's always been. And so to say the Constitution has nothing to do with morality is wrong. And so I'll cite the Constitution to support an argument, but that's not the main argument I'm making. The main argument I'm making is that there's a difference between certain types of government spending. Some types of government spending is justified and moral and it's okay.
Sure.
Other types of government spending are completely immoral and wrong. And UBI, taking money from your neighbor and then giving it to your other neighbor, is completely unjustified and terrible. And it's just not fair. It's whether you want to call it fairness, morality, whatever. It's not fair to take money from somebody just to give it to somebody else.
Look, I mean,
How is that
again,
fair?
you're saying to take money from one to give to somebody else. Again, you're saying it depends on the purpose for why you're giving it to someone else, because all
Yeah,
government
it does.
programs are
I am
taking
saying.
money to give from one to someone else. So the
Exactly.
purpose is
So
what matters.
if you're
The purpose
giving
here,
it-
you're saying the purpose. Wait a minute. You're
Right.
saying the purpose here is to, if I'm saying the purpose is to basically all the good things that people talk about with UBI, you're saying that purpose is illegitimate and therefore this is immoral. Whereas the purpose of, say, giving it to the military is a good purpose and therefore it's moral.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, that is so subjective. I don't even know how you could call it a question of morality. And I would dispute the point that all law is based on morality. I mean, I think a lot of what the Constitution is not really a moral question. It's a practical question. I mean, it was a document designed not just to provide a foundation of law, but to bind the Union together and to, represent various compromises between different interests. I mean, this Constitution sanctioned slavery for a long time. That certainly was immoral, but it was done for reasons of practicality.
Well, that's completely wrong. The Constitution was set up to set the United States on the path to abolish slavery. The Constitution was the very foundation of equality for all and equal rights and everything else. So that's completely false to suggest that. And more importantly, your purpose behind the Constitution is not practicalities or whatsoever. The whole point of the Constitution is to protect our God-given inalienable rights, which is 100% a moral issue. The whole point is that we are born with inalienable rights and that the government cannot take and should not take them away. That's 100% the entire purpose behind the Constitution. That's why the Declaration of Independence starts with that and why we have the Bill of Rights and all those constitutional provisions in it. And
so that, again, I mean, the idea that the Constitution itself is basically embodiment of our God-given rights. I mean, I just don't think he can defend that. To say that the post office, for example, being an enumerated power of the federal government is a reflection of God-given truth. I mean, no, the Constitution has some of what you might call, in a reading of natural law, the embodiment of what many people call God-given rights. But I mean, the Constitution itself is full of compromises and full of exigency decisions, not just this restatement of timeless universalities. I mean, even our Bill of Rights, which I very much support, I mean, I think reflects not universal truth so much as the results of our shared history with the British of a tradition of common law. I mean, we took the best of what they rejected at that time and put it into our Constitution. But I mean, I reject this kind of universality argument, or not universality argument, because I think American values certainly can be universal, but the idea that they come from God.
okay, well, we're kind of far afield. Let me ask you. It sounds to me like you actually are in favor of UBI sort of in and of itself, and where Andrew Yang's premise, which is a false premise, is that automation and robots and AI are going to completely wipe out all of these jobs. And so to me, but correct me if I'm wrong, like you support it for the sake of UBI. You're not, or are you a Yang Gang guy where it's like automation and robots and AI are going to take us out?
I think that he's right in the longer sense. Now, I think that when he talks about automation, part of that is also because I think it's a very easy issue to get your head around. And I do think it has some immediate threat. Like, when he talks about the issue of truckers and miners who are losing or going to lose their jobs in the near future, and who will really have a hard time transitioning to anything else. I mean, yeah, I think there's something to that. Now, at the same time, it's going to be a long time. I think it's not going to be too long a time, but it's going to be later in the 21st century that we have like 50% unemployment because just AI is now so good that, a lot of brain work is now automated. So I think that's not, we're not going to have that, in the next presidential term or anything. But I do support it even without the automation issue, primarily because I think poverty is, especially to the extent it endures and continues on, especially in disaffected areas, a long-term threat to democracy and to free markets. I think the rise of socialism in this country has been predicated on the very sketchy economic recovery we've had, where there's been a lot of growth, say, in the stock market. and among the richest among us, but where there's been a lot less economic growth in, I guess, what you might call mainstream, right? And so I think we could stabilize some of the increasingly extreme politics in this country, kind of increasingly populist authoritarian politics in this country, if we had some guarantees that made people feel like they had a little more faith in the capitalist system, like they, stood to gain something by continuing to be a part of it. I think it would, for example, stop socialism in its tracks if we had a solid universal basic income. Because, I think once you've got some basic material guarantees, you're not so easily susceptible to ideas like world revolution and abolish capitalism and all that kind of nonsense.
Dude, no way. The first thing that's going to happen is a bidding war amongst politicians about who can promise a bigger raise than UBI. So we start out at $1,000 a month, and the very next election, you've got leftists saying $1,000 a month is not enough. $1,000 we need $1,500 a month, and then the next election it's $2,000 a month. That's what happens. That's what happens all the time. And at some point, then that's straight up. It's on the road to socialism. This is more socialism. This isn't going to like reduce the spread of socialism. This is going to just massively increase socialism. And so, so like that, like it's just going to go up and up and up until then. And then all of a sudden now it's going to get so high that actually all of your marginal benefits, that to the extent they even exist, are going to go away.
Well, now I think there's a couple of points to that. Now, you might be right that all of a sudden, if UBI were implemented, right now there's only one politician out there, and he's not even been elected in anything yet. Andrew Yang is basically the only person on the American political scene really pushing this idea in a meaningful way. Some other people will occasionally give some lip service to it. I think there are a couple of candidates for Congress who have also said, we like Andrew Yang, we support this idea too. But for the most part, it's just Andrew Yang, right? And so the idea that if he were president and if this were implemented, suddenly it would be a sea change in American politics where all politicians will then suddenly start to compete on this idea that just a few years ago they had no interest in. I'm not so sure about that. But even if you said that, even if you think that's the case, the fact is that the way it would work right now with the 20% tax and the $1,000 a month, I mean, at some point, you can raise the benefit, I suppose, but at that point you also have to raise the taxes. And if you continually raise the tax, you negate the effect of you negate the effect of the benefit. So there would be, there's a natural check on that, in the sense that you can't just have unlimited money to everybody, because there's only so much money you can tax in the first place. But I think it really is worth rethinking the idea that it would push more socialism, because unlike a lot of the other programs proposed out there by not just the other Democrats, but even President Trump with his program of ever-increasing tariffs, universal basic income enmeshes capitalism in our system by not playing favorites with how you spend your money or what you spend your money on, and by preserving the profit motive rather than, say, subjecting us to something like Bernie's terrible federal jobs guarantee, which would gradually nationalize the economy. This pushes back on that kind of stuff by preserving the basics of capitalism while basically just ensuring that people don't have to start at zero anymore.
It's the opposite of capitalism. Like, you're literally growing the government. You're making the government bigger. You're increasing taxes. You're reducing people's freedom. It's like it's not freedom, and it's not a dividend. You reduce people's freedom by now you're taking more money from people. You're taking money out of the private sector and you're funneling it through big government. And then it's going to cost $1,200 in taxes or $1,500 in taxes to get $1,000 check sent out because of all the bureaucratic mess and administrative costs that happen in DC. And so the idea that this is
where's that number come from? To say that it would cost 20% of the program just to mail a check?
I pulled that number out of my butt.
Okay.
But it's going to cost. There's administrative costs. There's no doubt about it. And the government's one of the most inefficient bureaucratic nightmares that exists on planet Earth. So the point is, maybe it's $1,000 and $5 in taxes. The point is that you're going to lose some blood on the floor while you're doing this transfusion from your right arm to your left arm. But so. It's not capitalism. It's moving more towards social. And so, frankly, you made a good point, though, about Yang's the only one promoting this. It's not likely to get passed. You're right about that, and I think
if he wins, I mean, anything's possible at that point. But right now.
But you're right, and so you're right about that, and I think that actually says quite a bit about UBI, because when you've got Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren who won't even go along with this, you know that there's something wrong with it, because this is the biggest giveaway, bribery, Santa Claus electioneering scam that I've ever heard of. This is even more of a bribe and trying to buy votes than saying free health care for everybody, and I'm going to tax the rich, and let's build on your resentment towards rich people and soak it to the rich and give me money.
Anytime.
And blah, blah,
That's
blah,
like
blah, blah.
saying a tax cut is a bribe. I mean, if you enact a policy because you're trying to get support, I mean, that's politics. That's not a bribe. I mean, any kind of policy you could argue is a bribe in that sense.
No, a tax cut's the exact opposite. The only way that
if a tax cut is issued like the last one was, with a whole lot of government debt backing it up, then that's a straight bribe in and of itself.
Okay,
so the idea that you're doing something with government, that's a bribe. I mean, the fact that this transfer is more direct does not make it any more, or rather any less, or any different in terms of bribery than any kind of government program that involves benefits to some at the expense of others.
Wrong. The entire for that statement to be right, and your premise is that all the money is the government's, and when they don't tax you, that's just the government allowing you to keep some of your money. The money is ours. The government taxes it and takes it from us. It's not a bribe. It's not a bribe for the government to say, I'm not going to take as much money from you. A bribe is saying, hey, vote for me, and I'm going to take a bunch of money from somebody else and give it to you. See, one of those is saying, I'll let you keep more of your money. The other is saying, I'm going to take money from somebody else and give it to you. So, but my main point was that that the fact that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren won't support this, I think shows that there's got to be something wrong with it, because but more importantly though is if it ever did get passed, if Andrew Yang won and a bunch of Yang gangers took over the House and Senate and they passed this, then there would be a bidding war, because at that point now we would have it, and now it would be a bidding war to see how highly up we can increase the amount. It's literally happened with every single government program. Look at the government intervention in the healthcare sector. It's one bribe after another by these Democrats to expand healthcare paid for by somebody else.
I mean, that's like calling, say, President Bush's expansion of Medicare Part B a bribe.
I was opposed to that. I was opposed to the expansion.
I just don't. I mean, you can say it's a bribe, I guess, but that's like saying all taxation is theft. And I mean, if you want to say that, it's fine in the sense that I guess you're right, but you're right in such a general sense that I don't know that it has any practical meaning. I mean, if you're saying that defense contractors are going to get more money because you're going to increase defense spending, and therefore those defense contractors heavily contribute to your campaign, I mean, that itself is a bribe. I mean, that goes as far as the argument that taxation is theft goes. And I mean, that's a useful argument in thinking about things philosophically, but I mean, in a practical sense, that just writes off all government activity. So okay. I really want to push back on that. But another point I really want to push back on is your surprising defense here. I don't think you're defending, but it's just kind of surprising to me the way you raised up Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Because
well, I got to give them credit.
Warren, yeah, I understand that. I mean, they want programs that are very different. Bernie Sanders specifically, I don't know as much about all of Elizabeth Warren's programs because so far they don't seem as bad as Bernie Sanders' programs. But in particular, his federal jobs guarantee program, I mean, that kind of program is basically about gradually nationalizing the United States economy, one little piece, one little program at a time, through taking these private jobs and gradually creating these government alternatives, these government make-work programs, and will gradually take more and more of the economy over, because his priority is socialism, right? That's his goal. I'm sure we both agree on that. He's a self-declared democratic socialist, and he wants to implement, all the elements of a democratic socialist program. Of course, they don't want universal basic income. They don't want people to make basic decisions about their individual lives. They want people to go through government. They want people to come together in this democratic collective. So yeah, they're against UBI, especially Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders folks have been the other most vehement, arguers against UBI that I've spoken with so far, because they want control over the economy. They don't want capitalism to exist. They don't want people to make purchasing decisions on their own. They don't like the profit motive, and UBI preserves all of that. Imperfectly, I'd argue, of course, because all taxation is a form of theft and all government handouts are a form of bribery, but it preserves that stuff all the same.
Okay, I disagree with that. I think the reason that they don't want it is because it's not politically feasible. They could never win an election, because if I think this debate will be an example of why they don't support it, because it won't be able to win political arguments in elections. And you're the point about they don't want it because it preserves some form of capitalism or whatever you said, which is wrong. Maybe you could argue that if it's just $1,000 a month, but to suggest that once we have $1,000 a month, that then the politicians and bureaucrats aren't going to come in and say, okay, we're giving you $1,000 a month, but here's a bunch of strings attached to it. Here's a bunch of regulations. Here's a bunch of things you can spend it on. Here's a bunch of things you can't spend it on. Of course, that's coming. That's the natural flow of government. The entire premise behind our Constitution and our government is that the government naturally expands. The government naturally grows in power. And so this is just another example of a massively expanding federal government, which has already gone way out of control. And the moment that they're given $1,000 a month is the next day, they're going to be trying to put stipulations and strings on that money. And they're going to have just as much control as they would with any of these Bernie programs.
I mean, I wouldn't deny your point here that the natural tendency of government to grow is, I mean, you're right. Now, I don't think it's always in one direction. Sometimes under the great President Reagan, for example, government can shrink, a little bit, maybe not quite as much as we would have liked, but it can shrink. So it's not a one-way thing forever. Although the arc of history, while long, does seem to bend toward bigger government. But to borrow a phrase from Martin Luther King, not quite, paraphrasing a little
close.
His was the arc of history bends toward justice. But anyway, but what you're making now, the argument that, well, government's going to grow, so we can't do something. I mean, that's like an anti-federalist argument that we can't have this Constitution because, today we're free, but they're going to use this Constitution to gradually restrict our liberties. That's an argument against taking any kind of government action whatsoever to me. And I just don't know that that's, if you can implement a good program, right? The fact that somebody in the future might make it into a bad program, it just depends on the merits. Like, I'll agree with you in some sense. The federal jobs guarantee, which is the Bernie alternative to this, is a truly bad program because not only is it going to start bad, but it can only ever get worse. Now, I don't accept the premise that the $1,000 a month can only ever get worse. I guess it just depends on how voters want to handle it, but I don't believe that voters are so short-sighted and miserable that they would vote for something ridiculous like some kind of unsustainable increase to UBI.
Well, okay, so the only reason I made that point was to rebut your argument that this would not be as much government control over people as the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warrens. And so I make that point to say that actually it very well could be, and here's how it happens. This is how it always happens. That's the natural arc here. And then you say, well, that's too generalized of an argument that prevents you from saving any program. It's like, well, yeah, kind of. That's the whole, the point is that you've got to be careful when you expand government power.
That's true.
That's true. You got to be very careful about this. And so I just think that to get back to the original argument, like this, like to suggest that, okay, so this is a good program that's not going to be abused by the politicians in Congress. It's not going to be sucked dry. It's not gonna be used for social engineering like the IRS code is used for. I think is preposterous given the history of Congress.
Well, I think you're right to say that there will be, like, for example, if my dream came true, Andrew Yang won and then got a UBI through Congress. I think you're right that basically, after a few months, some story would come out where some individual had spent all their UBI on lotto tickets and booze, and somebody would come out of the woodwork and say, hey, we need to have controls on how it's spent, thereby basically using a fringe example to undermine one of the key benefits of the program, which is that most people, can make individual decisions for themselves. I think you're right that kind of impetus is there. That being said, I mean, the issue there is to just fight against that, because you're right. If you had a UBI that had a bunch of conditions, it's no longer really the UBI, right? Whereas I think, I don't know that that's an argument against the program we're talking about now. I think it's a simple case to argue against that, to say, look, there are exceptions. We acknowledge those up front where people will make bad decisions. But on the whole, we trust that most people have the individual agency to make good decisions. Poverty isn't a character flaw. It's a fact of life that can be corrected with more money, unless you think it is a character flaw.
Trusting people to make their own decisions is an argument against UBI, because what UBI does is it actually reduces your ability to make decisions, because now, instead of being able to go out and work and earn money, now you're having to pay way more in taxes so that this money can be funneled to somebody else. So if you trust people to make decisions, that's the Adam Smith free hand of the free market. And this is totally opposite of that.
Well, people at a certain amount of wealth would be losing more than they get under this. I mean, I think the top 10 to 20% of the population, but I mean, those people already have clearly demonstrated that they make good decisions with money, or at least make decent enough decisions with money, since they've still got some to spend and be taxed on. I mean, most people, though, would get more out of the program than they'd contribute. So I'm not sure how it would limit their range of freedom. I mean, you're right that you're taxed more, but your costs, the amount of money you have in your pocket at the end of the day is increased for about 80% of Americans. So for at least that majority of people, I mean, their range of motion is only enhanced. I mean, you could argue that the top 20, theirs is limited, but I mean, it's not, it's not like an everyone thing. I mean, at that point, it just doesn't seem any more limiting than, say, progressive income tax.
Well, I mean, frankly, my argument about like the natural flow, we should oppose UBI because of it'll naturally grow. Politicians will naturally want to expand it. Politicians will naturally want to put stipulations on it, thereby reducing the very benefits it's supposed to have. Applies equally to its funding mechanisms. And so one of the main things that Andrew Yang has proposed to pay for this is this financial transactions tax of 0.01%, which again is the same thing Elizabeth Warren did. The problem with that is that will eventually have to go up, because what it does is basically, it's like if you sell $1 million of stock and then buy it, now you have to pay $2,000. And so now that basically day traders are going to be doing way fewer trades. That's going to reduce the liquidity in the market, reduces the overall number of transactions. And so they've got this calculation based on 0.01% of every transaction. Well, once you implement that boom, now your transaction numbers go way, way down. And so then it doesn't bring in as much money as you thought it was going to do, or as you thought it was going to bring. And so then what do you got to do? You got to raise it from 0.01% to 0.02 or 3%. Not only that, but that would actually also cause a substantial amount of capital flight from the United States to stock markets overseas, because if you could buy a stock on the London Stock Exchange and you don't have to pay a financial transactions tax, so you have to fund UBI, you're going to go buy it in London and sell it in London. And so now all of a sudden you've reduced America's competitive advantage on all of these stock things. And so it's not just the payment side of UBI that would completely go insane and destroy the country and the economy. It's the funding part of it too, which is, this is going to cost between $2, $3, $4 trillion a year on top of everything. Like our entire government right now is spending like $4 trillion. Like this is almost doubling the size of the federal government, when we need to be we need to be doing the exact opposite and reducing the size of the federal government, not expanding it. And this could double the size of the federal government, double the amount of tax revenues, and then all you're going to just see is for it to continue to grow. This is a recipe for disaster.
Well, now when you say doubling the size of the federal government, I mean, I suppose in a technical sense it is doubling the budget of the federal government, but the effective size, the weight that it has on your everyday life, government rules and regulations and, bureaucracy and the buildings that support it, that is in no way doubled. So, I mean, I think it's important to be clear about what we mean by the doubling of the size of the federal government.
No, I was talking about money.
Yeah. In budgetary terms, sure. But I mean, in terms of like the weight of government activity on your life, I mean, again, for most people, the only thing they're going to see is more money in their pocket.
Well, no, you're doubling.
There's going to have to be an office that, will hand out the checks. But
you're doubling taxes too, though.
Small. No, now that depends on how you're doing it. I mean, in terms of doubling taxes, that's not, it's funded chiefly by a new tax, a value-added tax, a consumption tax, right? Which is, I think, one of the least harmful forms of taxation, in that it doesn't punish you. First of all, it's flat across all incomes. It's like a sales tax. It's something based on your consumption. It doesn't punish you for doing better in life, except in the sense that if you're consuming more things, you're necessarily paying more taxes, but you're also enjoying the benefits of more consumption. So it's not like a discriminatory tax in the way that, say, or a progressive tax in the way that, say, an income tax is, where it literally goes up the better you do in life. So I mean, I think in terms of taxation, it's a pretty ideal form of it. Now, the financial transactions tax side of it, that is a small part of the overall funding. So maybe, if you're right, that it would cause capital flight. And again, I'm not sure that it would, because if the United States has a small financial transaction tax, but it's still like better than what you could get overseas, I don't think that really makes a difference. I mean, ultimately, people are going to do business here if they can do business here for less than they can do it overseas. But I mean, if that's the case, that's a question of tinkering the means of implementing it. Maybe your VAT's higher or maybe not. I mean, the one point I would say about the Yang plan in particular is that it does rely to some degree on this idea of economic growth that would result. And I think that's as dangerous as saying that a tax cut is going to create economic growth, because it's going to put more money in people's pockets. And that is just not always true. Same would be the case with UBI. I'm kind of skeptical of that side of it, although I do think it's at least as possible as it is with respect to tax cuts.
Well,
so that part I think you could argue with somewhat, but the rest of it, I mean, I think that's just an implementation question on the numbers. I mean, it's certainly not the same as, say, Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, which is basically straight up theft. I mean, because that's not a
right.
That's not a tax of income, which, I mean, again, the
wealth tax is unconstitutional.
Whether we like it. Well,
isn't it? I mean, we had to pass a constitutional amendment to have an income tax. We do not have a.
Which tax are you saying is unconstitutional in addition to wealth tax?
No, Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax.
Okay, all right, yeah. So, okay, I just want to make sure, because I agree that in some sense, the wealth tax seems unconstitutional, because you'd also have to apportion it, and it doesn't seem like
right. But hold on,
to apportion it.
You said a lot there.
Make it constitutional. All right, well, so let me just all right, you respond to that. But
okay,
I do want to say it's better than the wealth tax, which is like straight up theft of existing property that has already been taxed.
Well, okay, from what I found on Andrew Yang's plan, actually the value added tax is a small portion of the cost of UBI, and the bigger portion is the eliminating the cap on Social Security, a big hike of capital gains, the financial tax. He also wants a carbon tax, but regardless, let's assume all of these taxes are enough to fund it and not destroy the economy, which is highly suspect. So either way, you're going to have to take taxes in enough to pay for this, and whether it's $2 trillion or $4 trillion, whether it's expanding the government by 50% or whether it's doubling the size of the government in terms of how much money they're taking out of the economy, it still remains true that you're doubling how much money you're taking from the American citizen.
Yeah, but I mean, again, for most people, they're getting more after all of this. So, I mean, the only people who are having their purchasing power cut are like the richest among us. So, I mean, in that sense, it does fall more heavily on the rich. But I mean, otherwise, 80% of Americans under his plan are better off than they were before. So while their tax rate does go up, I mean, it's like the Bernie Sanders versus Elizabeth Warren argument on healthcare. I mean, irrespective of what you think of their plans, Bernie Sanders says, look, yeah, I'm going to raise your taxes, but your costs go down, so you end up with more money in your pocket. Elizabeth Warren refuses to say that because she doesn't want to concede that taxes could go up. That's kind of squirrely. But I mean, whatever you think of Bernie Sanders' plan, he's arguing that, his argument is that you're going to have more overall because your costs outweigh the tax increase. So, I mean, if you accept that that's a possibility, then, I mean, the fact that your taxes are increased isn't the problem here. And again, you're right. The value-added tax is the single biggest element. It's only a portion of how it's paid for. I just sent a link out in my chat to what I'm looking at here, and I just send it to you on the Discord too. That's where I'm getting this from. The financial transactions tax is a small part of it. The carbon fee is a part of it. The other big component, though, is the welfare overlap and the reduced poverty expenses. That's another 800 billion. That's those programs that are basically being replaced, and those programs which would be alleviated somewhat. Like if people are mired in less poverty, then some of the other harder to think about on an everyday basis costs of poverty go down. Like those costs of policing impoverished communities. If they're slightly less impoverished, maybe crime goes down a little bit. You have some reduced costs there too. But the welfare overlap is a big point to keep in mind too. I mean, you just don't have to pay as much for some programs if they've been replaced by the universal basic income. So,
well, yeah. I mean, I'm suspicious of Andrew Yang's little graph there because it's a self-serving
such a cute little graph. I mean, but I'm suspicious of the economic growth part. I'll grant you that part I'm suspicious of, but I'm suspicious of that when they say it's the case with tax cuts too, and it didn't bear out with the last one. I mean, it just went to debt.
It doesn't make sense how you. Okay, first of all, the rich in this country are already paying almost all of the taxes, especially almost all of the federal income taxes. So I think it's like the top 20% pay 80% of all of the federal income taxes. So the idea that you're actually defending UBI by saying we're going to soak it to the rich even more, I think is completely unfair because the rich are already paying the vast majority of taxes, and taxes aren't our problem in this country. It's spending. If you actually look at the growth of, we're collecting record amounts of tax revenues right now. We're collecting insane amounts of tax revenue. We're still running huge deficits, and almost all of that comes from the increase in spending, and that's been true since World War II. I mean, the spending has just gone up massively, and so what we really need to be doing here is decreasing federal government spending, not increasing it. Like, we're broke. We're running $1 trillion deficits. You're going to add another $3 or $4 trillion a year, like $40 trillion over the course of 10 years to a country when we're absolutely broke. And you're going to soak it to the rich who are already paying massive amounts of taxes. I mean, what's hilarious is this starts to sound like as contradictory as Elizabeth Warren. Like, Elizabeth Warren says, rich people, they'll do anything to avoid taxes. They'll go overseas. They'll go offshore. They'll leave the country. They'll even give up their American citizen. So you know what we should do? Let's tax the shit out of the rich. Really screw the rich. It's like, this is going to backfire so hard. Like, people are going to start there's going to be even more tax evasion. People are going to leave the country. It's not a good way to go.
Well, first of all, I don't think anybody's leaving for the 20% value-added tax because the countries they leave to, other developed countries already have a 20% or higher value-added tax across Europe. There may be some developed countries that are an exception to this, but especially in Europe, I believe Japan has this too. Any other developed countries you could conceivably leave to are already implementing this kind of value-added tax. The other smaller ones, like the carbon fee and the financial transactions tax, I'll admit I'm not sure what the status of those is in other countries. I'm not sure there are many people doing carbon taxes right now. I'm not sure that those are either, in Yang's plan, big enough to really be making a difference. But the big one, the value-added tax, that's already going on. So I just don't know where you're going to flee in the world. Maybe some people will go to poor countries that have super low rates of taxation to try and hoard their wealth, but I kind of doubt it. That being said, though, this is also, I think, categorically different from what Elizabeth Warren is proposing here. The taxes to pay for UBI are taxes on future purchases that you make, future consumption. It's basically like a national sales tax, right? That is categorically different from saying, hey, if you've got a $50 million mansion, you better turn some of that into liquidity, pal, because you owe me 2% on it now. You know what I mean?
I agree that those are different.
That's a real change in behavior. That's the kind of thing that at some point, I think maybe you want to start thinking about fleeing from. So, I mean, I don't think it's the same there, that it's really comparable. I mean, because what Andrew Yang is proposing is a plan that would basically bring us, up to par with these other countries, whereas the wealth tax is something that these other countries have up to par in terms of taxation. Of course, we are in a class of our own in all other, in all truly meaningful respects. But it would bring us up to par in terms of taxation, and it's different from a wealth tax, which some of these countries have tried, and I believe all of them have abandoned. So
no,
that's just straight up
no.
yeah.
Yeah, so since we're talking about that, this was one point that I was going to raise with you with the UBI, and you're absolutely right that some countries in Europe have tried wealth taxes and they've ended up repealing them. Also, same thing with UBI. Both Canada and Finland have tried some form of UBI, and they have both of them have canceled it early and eliminated it and said this is way too expensive, it's unsustainable, and they've canceled it. And so like I'm just having a hard time seeing why you support this when literally everybody that's tried it has had to cancel it, and like Finland and Canada are the two that I saw that like literally had to cancel them early. I mean, Finland is supposed to like release apparently data on its experiment in 2020, but the fact remains that they did cancel it early.
No, you're right. They did, and look, I mean, we'll know more about what happened in Finland when the data comes out. Now, in Canada, what happened was there was a liberal government that was running this program. A conservative government was elected and said, we don't want to spend money basically to find out how this program will work out. We think it's a bad idea, and so they terminated it. But they didn't terminate it based on the results of the program. They just terminated it on the argument that, look, this is an unnecessary expense. We just want to cut government. And so rather than throw more money at this to see how it'll turn out, we'll cut it, right? So the data was basically packaged up, put into the National Archives, and largely went unanalyzed for about 30 years until it was rediscovered in the 90s. So, I mean, it wasn't a verdict on the effectiveness of the program. It was just a decision to say, look, to cut expenses, we're cutting this program. The programs in the United States, again, those were evaluated as successful at the time, with the exception of the caveat on divorce rates, which was later found to be, that was incorrect. Divorce rates didn't really budge one way or another. So, I mean, in terms of the studies that have been done, the only one that I think is out there to look at that might be negative is the Finnish one. And when that comes out next year, I mean, we'll know more. But I mean, it's also possible that the Finns made the decision that the Canadian conservatives made, which was just, oh, we don't care. We don't want to spend money on this. It's an obviously absurd idea. So why would we spend more money on it? Which is fine. But I mean, that's not a verdict on the experiment itself.
Well, I mean, it kind of is, though, because it was so expensive that ultimately the people, the political will, the people as represented through their elected representatives decided that this was unsustainable financially and economically. And so, I mean, frankly, the same thing would likely happen in the United States. It would end up being canceled even if it got passed, and whether it was Republicans or anybody else. The point is that this stuff is insanely expensive, and it literally wouldn't.
If you're right about that, though, then that's. I mean, if people do that, then it negates the other point you made, that politicians would be competing with one another to raise it higher, right? I mean, if you're saying that eventually it would go, well, I mean, I guess it sounds like it was worth a shot then. If you're just saying it's going to go, then we'll be able to answer the question forever, right?
True.
I mean, I would say that I would say that ideally we would do some more experiments with it. I mean, first. That would be the ideal, rather than to just say, okay, Yang is president, let's do it everywhere now. I mean, it would ideally we could do a couple of good modern experiments and find out. At least maybe the Finnish one will come through, and that'll be enough to, But anyway, I think I think it's the experiments in the past have, I think, been generally favorable for it. So.
Okay. Well, we can disagree on that, because from what I can tell, the experiments have all been canceled, and they resulted in marginal benefits, extremely expensive, people working less, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just let me ask you, do you agree? Do you remember when Nancy Pelosi said a couple of years ago, she said that unemployment payments are the best stimulus spending ever? You remember
I don't remember her saying that, but I mean, that sounds, it sounds like something a politician might say.
So do you agree with that? Because the premise behind UBI is that, hey, let's just give all this money to people, they'll spend it, that'll boost the economy, is false, and it's the same thing is false about unemployment. And if you don't think that unemployment payments are a great economic boon, then
Well,
what's the distinction?
you can argue this is more of a priorities argument, I think, but you can argue that money taken in essence from those who have a lot locked up in various assets can be put to more immediately useful purposes if given to basic consumers who will then immediately spend it in some fashion, right? They won't just, they won't just sit on it, they'll spend it in some fashion. And that's, I mean, the same argument you'd make about, the Bush tax cuts. They drove consumption. They pushed economic growth in a time when we needed it. So, I mean, you can make that argument. I mean, I think UBI is certainly better than, say, an unemployment program where you have to spend a lot of time engaged in what is probably useless labor, like going to, you have to go and apply to a certain number of jobs all the time to get these, payments. And it doesn't matter what kind of jobs they are. It doesn't matter if they're fitting. You just have to hit your numbers and, maybe you have to attend some kind of courses or something, I mean, all that state intervention that I feel like probably it probably doesn't make a difference except to waste people's time. So I would say that UBI is still better in that sense because it doesn't come with that baggage. I mean, people want jobs almost universally, so they're gonna get them in their good time because ultimately 12K is not enough to live on. It's enough to keep you eating and maybe to keep a roof over your head, but it's certainly not enough to live a life that anybody would really.
Okay, well, so
few exceptions.
You brought that. You reminded me of something I wanted to say earlier, which is this idea that if we're going to do UBI, we nailed it right on the head. $1,000 is the exact perfect amount. And we got to trust Andrew Yang that $1,000 is the absolute perfect amount for UBI. And it's just like this reeks of central planning because in order to come up with an amount for UBI, you have to figure out what amount will not destroy the economy by making everybody no longer work. And so it can't be too high, and it can't be. I guess it can't be too low. I guess it could be too low, but the idea that it landed exactly on $1,000, I just think goes to show you how big of a scam this is, and trying to because $1,000 is such a nice easy sell. It's like, hey, $1,000 a month, real easy, rolls off the tongue, blah 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 blah.
It does.
And so, why should we trust the government when they're terrible at everything they do? Why should we trust them to accurately determine this magical number that's going to be this wonderful thing? Even though obviously I don't think it would be, but even if you accept every other premise that pumping blood from one arm to the other arm is going to be this great thing for the economy. How are you going to, why should we trust the government to determine how much blood we should pump from our right arm into our left arm?
Well, while I do reject the blood premise, I admire how colorful and visceral it is. I don't think it's the same thing. But that being said, because I already mentioned a few times, and I just kind of keep letting it go. But look, I mean, you may be right that $1,000 isn't the right amount, but I mean that's something we could discuss. I mean, I'm sure Andrew Yang chose it for reasons that include, hey, that's a easy figure to get your head around. If you said, I want every American to have $1,022.50 because we did a study and that's like the perfect amount, or $971. Yeah, that's less easy to get your head around. So I mean, I think that's certainly part of it, but $1,000 a month is not a crazy figure. Like in Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, when he talks about what an ideal negative income tax amount would be, he settled on $300 in 1964 bucks, which is significantly more than $1,000 a month, right? So I mean, and of course he wanted to eliminate other programs, but I mean, at some point, I guess you do settle on a number and you see how it works. The number would probably be adjusted, with time based on how things worked out in practice. But the idea that it reeks of central planning, I feel like it's the opposite. I mean, a single national figure, I think is probably less central planning than, say, if you did what some people have proposed, which is to vary it up based on where you live, right? So some people say if you have a UBI and you're like in California, you're in San Francisco, what's going to happen to your UBI? It's going to be eaten up by the housing policies out there that, restrictive zoning that just, restrictive zoning that prevent people from building, new affordable housing. It's just going to be eaten up by your landlord. Well, right now, California, the one upside of their terrible rent control policy is that I guess if you got UBI, it would take some time for the landlord to eat it all up from you. But then again, you could take your $1,000 and move somewhere else where you might be able to make it go farther too. So I mean, it's not, to me, if you wanted to say, well, let's adjust that based on your conditions and so on and so forth, that might be, you might have an argument there that it's centralized. But here we're just saying this is an amount, everyone gets it, do with it what you will. I think that's about as minimal a form of central planning as you could imagine with any kind of federal program.
Okay, couple points. Number one, you just confirmed my earlier point that I was right, that the amount is going to have to be changed, and it's going to and that change is going to be from bidding wars amongst Democrats to try to increase it way up. Second of all, you brought up a really good point, that a lot of this money will be spent on housing all over the place and various other things, and so it actually what it'll do is drive inflation, because the moment landlords and businesses know that everybody has an extra $1,000 a month, they know that they can raise their prices. And so if somebody's getting an extra $1,000 a month, they can easily afford another extra $1,000 a month in rent, and so it would drive massive inflation. You're also right that it would cause extreme disruption in the economy from people moving. And so one thing that I've found really interesting is the idea that $1,000 a month you cannot live on in the United States, but you can live on $1,000 a month in certain other countries, including lots of Asian countries. And I've been looking at this because I saw somebody talking about Twitch streamers, like as a Twitch streamer, you can't live on $1,000 a month in the U.S., but if you wanted to go full-time Twitch streamer, you could move to an Asian country and make it. And so you're going to incentivize now massive disruption of people's lives and moving because you've got $1,000 a month everywhere. I mean, frankly, I think the point that everywhere in the country is different is a point in favor of our Constitution and federalism. And if you want to do UBI, do it at your state level. You try to force this on the whole country. And $1,000 a month for somebody in Montana is 100% different than $1,000 a month for somebody in New York City. And so you're gonna do a one-size-fits-all centrally planned amount that's going to be subject to a bidding war by politicians, and is going to cause people to move overseas. Because how many people are going to move to Malaysia or Vietnam or something like that or Philippines and take their little $1,000 a month of American taxpayer dollars and go spend it overseas because now they're able to live on this? I mean, this is one of the main problems with leftist policies is they never think back past stage one. And Thomas Sowell wrote a book, Thinking Past Stage One. Liberals and leftists never seem to do this. They don't think about unintended consequences. The amount of unintended consequences from this is staggering. I mean, I just came up with 2 or 3 myself. There's numerous additional unintended consequences that would have negative impacts.
I have no doubt that there would be some unintended consequences. I mean, there are with all policies. Now, I mean, the point you raised about people moving overseas and living off their government UBI, I guess maybe you might have to have a caveat that you only get your check if you live in the United States. Might need something like that.
Okay, but, so you're already proposing government rules and regulations.
That is so just like high level. Like, if you live in the United States and you're a citizen, I mean, that's like saying the rule that you can't be in prison is. I mean, that's pretty high level in terms of conditions. So I'm not going to put that in the category of saying, you can only spend it on this kind of stuff. I mean, you're right. If you're not paying into the system any value added taxes anymore, you're right. If you don't live in the United States anymore, that program doesn't work. I mean, that's like saying anybody who came over the border, illegally would get UBI, which is not true, of course. But I mean, if that were true, that would be a problem, right? Because again, if you're not a citizen, it might not work out. But that's not what we're talking about here. The bigger point you're raising is, first of all, I know you mentioned the bidding war again. I mean, again, if you're saying that this program is going to last the initial scrutiny, then the amount might change based on different circumstances, the same way that the minimum wage changes over time, right? I mean, that's not a given, but sometimes it does change. Maybe it would be implemented in such a way where it would, rise with an index to inflation. I don't know. I mean, I doubt that. But the big issue that you talked about is inflation. And that part I really have to push back on, because unless you're printing money to fund this, which Andrew Yang is not proposing to do. There's no plan to do this via borrowing. It's supposed to be by taxation. And if it's done via borrowing, or rather if it's done by printing money that would drive inflation, that would be a problem. Yeah, definitely. But if you mean inflation in the sense that prices would go up for certain goods, I think you've got all too little faith in free markets, because as long as there's competition in a market, there's still an incentive to keep your prices down. And it's only in very limited exceptions where we don't have competition where we might be subject to something like that. And the one that always comes to mind for me is San Francisco with housing, because they've got this this ridiculous policy of zoning where they prevent people from building up that makes housing prices go through the roof. So you're right. I mean, there are some examples where that could happen, but for the most part, we've got competitive markets in this country. McDonald's isn't going to jack their prices up because Burger King could just still compete on volume by keeping their prices the same. So I don't know that price inflation is no, I mean, it's not an inevitable outcome here, except in those areas where competition is not working. And those are, I mean, while they exist, they're relatively rare in our country, fortunately. But the other point I want to push back on is the idea of extreme disruption by virtue of people moving. I mean, I think mobility among citizens is not a problem. I mean, if people want to move somewhere to improve their outcomes, that should be celebrated.
Well, I agree, but it shouldn't be incentivized by the government. It shouldn't be incentivizing and trying to get people to move. That's like trying to socially engineer where people live. But your analysis on the inflation thing is correct with respect to one part of it. You're talking about the supply, and you're right. There would still be competition amongst supply of goods, and there would still be free market forces driving down prices on the supply side. The other half of the equation is demand, though. And when you increase demand by pumping all of this money away from people who are using it to invest in capital goods to grow a business, for example, and now you're taking it from a rich person who's using it to grow a business and you're giving it to somebody else who now is going to be using that for consumption goods. Now your demand goes way up for consumption goods. You still have the same supply, but now you have a higher demand that increases prices.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know that I just don't know that I could agree to that, because the more consumption, I mean, that in essence is a different way, I guess, of getting money to businesses. If people are putting that money back into consumption, I mean, you're right that it would have some changes in the sense that money would be used more for consumptive purposes, maybe than for other purposes. Maybe there would be less high level financial activity because it's more like low level consumption. But I mean, I just don't know that that's an argument against the program any more than saying, if we cut taxes, that's more money instead of going through government. It's going to be spent on consumption and investment. I mean, you can argue the which is better, but I mean, to say that government has no role in that, I mean, government does that all the time. So even the aspect of moving around different places, I mean, some states will compete on where businesses should be, and to the point where they will like excuse specific businesses from taxes, like the Amazon headquarters too kind of deal, where there was a bidding war between states to give Amazon special tax treatments or subsidies to get them to move somewhere. I mean, yeah, I get that. That's I don't like that either. Or I don't like that. Maybe I'm not sure how you feel about that. I don't really like that idea of like giving special tax treatment to some to incentivize them to move. But I mean, at the same time, that's I mean, UBI is certainly no different than that, and it's much less targeted. I mean, it's saying you do whatever you want, and some people might choose to move. I imagine a lot of people, probably most people, would choose not to. But so let me ask you this. So we've been going back and forth about this for almost an hour and a half. How are you feeling about how do you feel about this idea? And is there anything else you'd like to talk about, or do you think you'd like to take some questions, or what are you thinking?
Well, frankly, I mean, I wanted to talk more about automation because that's the entire premise behind why Andrew Yang says we need it. Now, you basically said you don't care as much about you would support UBI even without this.
Right.
Like automation, I mean, the automation arguments of Andrew Yang are so easily debunked that I'd love to talk about that. But I don't know but I mean, you did say that like automation of truck driving jobs would be a bad thing, right?
Well, I don't, when I say it's a bad thing, I don't say that it's a bad thing objectively. I think it's a good thing objectively, in the sense that there'll probably be fewer accidents, because a computer, if it can do something, it'll probably be doing it better. You know, computer won't fall asleep, it won't get distracted, it won't get drunk. I mean, it won't do anything like that. I'm not saying the truckers are drunk or anything. I'm sure that just like any other driver, though, occasionally there's somebody who throws back a cold one on a long, lonely highway drive. But, you know, I mean, the computers don't have any of those problems, right? So if they can do the job as well, they'll probably do it better. So in terms of public safety, I'm sure it's a benefit for sure. It probably would reduce costs eventually. So I mean, the only people who will lose out will be the truckers themselves, and that's something to consider for sure. Normally, one of the, you know, I'm very pro free trade, pro getting rid of tariffs, because I think generally we all benefit from this stuff, and it's just a few of us that suffer very greatly for it. You know, we lose our jobs, for example. And automation, I think, is kind of comparable in that sense. Most people will benefit from the abundance of greater productivity, more safety that will come with it, but some people will lose out. And so I think rather than just kind of say to those people, well, you know, learn to code, figure it out, a UBI does kind of ease that transition somewhat. I think I probably am less sold on the immediacy of mass scale unemployment through automation, but I think that some sectors like trucking, yeah, that's coming real soon. You know, so
Okay. So, well, I don't actually. I mean, that's pretty correct. Everything you just said. I mean, the thing about free trade is, yeah, it'll hurt maybe an isolated group of people really bad,
yeah.
but the overall benefits to the economy go up. And the same thing happens with automation. And so like, I don't even like automation of truck driving jobs, like the benefits aren't even coming from the fact that computers would be safer. The benefit from automation of truck driving, and the whole problem with Andrew Yang's premise is that he doesn't understand that labor itself is a scarce resource. And so anytime you can actually free up your scarce resource of labor to be used on something else, that's a benefit to the entire economy. And so it's basically called like a labor saving device. And whether like automobiles put the buggy whip manufacturers out of work, the fishing net put individual fishermen out of work, the wheel put a lot of people out of work. The point is that when you implement a labor saving device, like let's say a computer that drives the truck, your costs come way down. That's why businesses do it, because it costs less to buy a computer than it does to pay a human being all the way. And so now your costs come way down. Several things happen from that. You basically are allowed to now have employment elsewhere in the economy. The cost of your shipment goes down, which means the price of the goods being shipped goes down. That either causes the profits to go up or causes prices of the goods to go down. If you have more profits, the business take the profits and invest in other businesses, and invest in capital equipment and grow the economy. That creates jobs, extra investments. So, and then if prices come down, that benefits consumers. And then now consumers can go buy more goods because they cost less due to the transportation costs coming down. That creates employment in the industries that produce the actual goods that are being purchased. And so, I don't think you disagree with any of that. This is basic kind of economic.
Basic economics,
yeah, that's basic economics. So I just, so much of why people support UBI is based on this automation scare, which is just complete BS, and is never going to happen. We're never going to have mass unemployment from automation. And so, like, I just find it interesting that you still support UBI even though you don't believe in the big automation scare, which is the entire premise of it.
There's one big difference there. I don't agree. I don't tend to think it's going to come so heavily so quickly, but I do think eventually, it's going to hit us. I mean, eventually, like the reason why you can argue that it's different this time, and this is beyond just truck drivers. Like let me get to the truck driver issue first. Like truck drivers and other people who their industries are wiped out, right? So you could say this was the case with factory workers as after we had free trade with China too. Just as an example. Like there are individuals who, maybe they're in their 50s, for example. It's just super hard for them to retrain to get another job. And just historically, for whatever reason, we just, as a society, seem to have a real hard time with that happening. Instead, they sink into kind of desperation. Disability benefits kind of become, more widespread as people try to get, that as a source of income. I mean, in every economic downturn, disability claims tend to rise. I mean, that just seems to happen. That happened after the last Great Recession. And, so, I mean, there's it's hard for many individuals who've been committed to one career for their whole life to just move on, do something, get something going that's different. And so those people are often left behind, right? And so the one reason in the short term for UBI is to provide something for those people instead of just saying, well, look, you're not really going to be able to do anything other than bag groceries for the rest of your life. Retraining for whatever reason just seems to be hard at that point in life. So you're just kind of going to have to suck it up so the rest of us can enjoy the benefits of free trade or short-term automation. Yeah. So, I mean, the point is to be a solution to that in one sense. But the other point, well, let's respond to that first, because that's a whole point. I don't want to lose automation, but the short-term benefit is that it provides something for those people, who just historically in the Midwest, a lot of places have been suffering. A lot of places have voted for Trump because they felt like the Democrats were ignoring their issues. I mean, those places were suffering from deindustrialization, and we don't have programs in place to help those folks who, when their industries are wiped out.
Okay, hold on. We have tons of programs in place. Like, this is one of the reasons that Andrew Yang's idea is so crazy is because he's not calling for the elimination of all the other programs, job training programs. And so we have the federal government giving tons of money for college and job training programs and everything else. And so now you're gonna give $1,000 a month to an 18-year-old, but no, that you don't use that on college. We're also going to pay for your college, and we're also going to subsidize moving costs, and we're also going to do XYZ. So it's like you can't use like all of these we need to take care of XYZ people with the $1,000 a month if you're not with UBI, if you're not reducing all of the other government spending that already exists to exactly take care of those issues. Like you could defend UBI on that basis if you were going to actually say, okay, we're going to give you $1,000 a month. That should go towards college to learn a new skill. But if you're going to say, here's $1,000 a month, and then here's also $50,000 in taxpayer guaranteed student loans, that doesn't fly.
Well, that's not, I mean, that's, first of all, that population is not the population covered by the argument I just made. I mean, I'm talking about, this is in the short term, a way to help people who are basically functionally unable to find employment at the level that they previously had it. So these are people who lose their jobs because of trade deals and who have been doing them for so long that it's just, this isn't a reflection on them in any way. It's just that the studies have shown that it's really hard to for the federal government to motivate longtime workers in particular industries to just find a new job. I mean, that's where the learn to code meme comes from. You've heard that, right? Just, you lost your job, learn to code though. That's just really hard for whatever reason, understandably enough. I mean, I feel like in 20 years, I'm probably going to be functionally incapable of doing anything other than legal stuff and Twitch streaming. That just seems to be the way we develop as human beings. And that's one way to address that. But as far as 18-year-olds go, I mean, they're not the ones who are suffering from that. They're, still learning and figuring things out. And UBI is helpful in that sense because rather than being tied to specific pathways, like say college, you could go on another path. You could start a business. You could maybe go to trade school. You could do whatever, so it's more flexibility for different individual circumstances. But as far as automation goes, because this was the second point raised, I do think that eventually down the line, maybe not 5 years from now, maybe not 10 years from now, but 20, 30, 40 years from now, we are going to have serious dislocation because automation is different this time in the sense that this is work that machines will always be able to do better. Like if you've got machines that can start to replicate the work that human minds do, at that point, what are human beings good for anymore? I mean, at a certain point, it's just, so far the big changes have been we've replaced labor work with brain work, right? I mean, that's been most of it. It hasn't been everything, but for the most part, we've taken labor and we've replaced it with, office work, that kind of work that you and I are fortunate enough to be able to do, right? I mean, now, for example, people, maybe used to not have as much they could spend on legal work because, they had to spend it on other things. And, now that the economy has changed, there are more people out there who can do legal work. More people have the freedom and the time to pursue their legal claims. So that's one example of what you're saying. Yeah, it creates new demand. But at a certain point, like if you could have robot lawyers, what are the lawyers going to do at that point? I mean, they're always going to be better at it because the advantages of a machine once it's sufficiently developed, and that's the argument here, is that this time it's different because technology is racing forward. I mean, unless you're saying that technology will never be that good, it is eventually going to happen. It's just a question of time scale.
Well, that's to me, that's just pure speculation. There's no evidence that that's going to happen. And in fact, we've been hearing those predictions so much, and they've been proven wrong so many times. What actually happens is, as you create automation and robots, other different jobs are opened up. And so, I mean, it's speculation. I mean, maybe someday that'll happen in 100 years. We're not anywhere close. Like, I don't know, like, if this was a big thing when you were in law school, but dude, I heard nonstop about AI and robots taking over. Like, there's entire books and law review articles talking about how the legal profession is going under. There's not going to be any law jobs. All of the lawyers are going to be unemployed. Like, right? You've heard that a million times.
Oh yeah. Another big one when I was in school was that they're all going to be offshored to like India.
Right. Yeah, we've been hearing all this stuff, and yet legal industry is doing just fine in the U.S.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's, I guess the point is that at a certain point, it is different it's different in another sense. Like right now, for example, it's way easier to do document review. And for those who are uninitiated, maybe we can cooperate on telling people about the miseries of document review, or at least what I feel like. It's kind of a miserable process. I don't know about you, but it feels pretty miserable to me. Which is to say, in preparation for a lawsuit or, you know, any kind of hot legal action, you get a wave of documents from the other side in the process of what is called discovery, where you go through and you try and, you know, investigate your case, right? And so to go through these thousands and thousands of documents, you have lawyers who have to, lawyers have to do this kind of stuff, go through pages and pages and pages of documents to build a case, to try and find that needle in a haystack. I mean, that's literally what it is, right? And so now with technology, we can somewhat automate some of that by, the same way if you've got a long document, you can control F and look for keywords. You can build programs that can look for specific language. So that's been automated somewhat, and that has reduced the demand for lawyers. It's meant that now lawyers can focus on the higher level strategy stuff, right? Is that a fair analysis of it?
No, I agree with that. But I mean, specifically with the doc review, like what you've actually seen now is literally new companies formed that do just doc review. And so for law firms that handle big litigation cases, they'll hire vendors that provide just doc review services. And then you have lawyers working at these doc review vendors, and they're not engaged in the traditional practice of law, but they're sitting there running these programs that do doc review, and they're doing all of these various other things. So I just think that's another example of where automation just creates different types of jobs. And so, look, I mean, if you want to speculate that someday AI and robots will take over all our jobs, like I'm not going to be able to convince you otherwise, but it's just pure speculation. And every time we've seen that prediction made in the past, it's been false.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand the weight of history is on the side of the argument you're making, but I think the progress of technology now, I think, is on my side of it. So, I mean, I wouldn't dispute that it's speculation in a sense. I mean, it's speculation based on emerging existing technologies, just, continuing on their logical progression. Like, unless we find something that makes the technological replication of the human brain like way harder or impossible in some form, I mean, eventually it's coming. So, I mean, I do think in the long term, that's a way to preserve capitalism in the future, because otherwise, I mean, if you've got any kind of serious sustained long-term employment, I mean, the whole thing breaks down, right? I mean, that's to me one of the other reasons that I like UBI, is that I worry that if we had any kind of large-scale dislocation in the future, that we get the kind of calls for government intervention of a more forceful nature that we had during the Great Depression, when people wanted to give Roosevelt like emergency dictatorial powers to create new jobs and, all that kind of stuff. Like I like UBI because while I agree it is an expansion of government, it's much more benign of an expansion than something like that,
Yeah, the problem is that it's not. I mean, you're stacking it on top of an existing massive bloated federal government welfare state. So, look, I mean, you'd have a lot easier time convincing me of UBI if you were also saying we were going to repeal basically most of what the federal government does, which is like 60-70% of all government spending is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And so you're going to take a massively bloated federal government that's running trillion-dollar deficits every year, and double the amount it's spending, double the amount that it's taxing, and suck all of this money out of productive sectors of the economy to then redistribute it. It's just not a compelling argument.
Well, now I would say that there are some people who argue, and I'm just not sure that we could ever provide an amount that would do all of this as well as saying, as well as what I'm proposing. But there are some people who say, well, okay, let's go further. Let's get rid of disability. Let's get rid of universal health care and just give people an amount of cash that is enough to where they can reasonably handle some mediocre level of all of this themselves. And then just say, okay, you do it. And that sounds like what you're talking about, basically, right? Like get rid of all other transfer programs and just, you could maybe bring me around if you just gave me a direct single cash payment. Right, that was intended to cover everything.
I still don't think I would be in favor of it, but it would. I think it's a lot stronger of an argument. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it might be possible to figure out a version of that works with that, but generally, I think just like healthcare costs are so variable that it's you either need none sometimes, or maybe a little, or maybe so much that it just is so catastrophic that no amount of cash given to you reasonably through a UBI program could ever cover it. So. I mean, I don't think we could do that, but I've heard people propose that idea in the past. I mean, Milton Friedman's negative income tax, his ideal version is, of course, premised on getting rid of all the other programs. But I mean, that one, that again, like his dollar amount was much higher, too. Like he was talking about his $300 figure would amount to, I think, about $2,500. So it just depends on how you do it. If you want to do it like that, I can see the advantages. I don't know that it works out in the wash, but I can see that as a possibility. Do you have any other? I wish I was more, more like automation is an immediate threat now. That would give you something you could push back on. But I share your skepticism. I do think it's eventually coming. So.
No.
So, any other thoughts, or is anybody chomping to ask some questions? Or
I think we've kind of covered everything, really. Yeah. That's all. Now it's an hour and 40 minutes on UBI.
Yeah. Well, that was good. I mean, I know you were saying you were thinking. I mean, we might go on 2 or 3 hours, but that was a good discussion.
That was. I agree.
So so how are you feeling? I mean, I know it's getting late. Are you still feeling like talking some more with maybe some people who'd like to talk to us, or I know we both got to work in the morning. So how are you feeling? You want to take some questions?
See, I've been live for 3 hours now. I'm feeling like it's the end of my stream here, but okay. I'm down for 1 or 2.
All right. Well, hey, I know we've got a mutual viewer here, Real Altruist, who wants to ask a question. Would you mind if we brought him in on the call to talk to us?
Bring him in.
Okay. All right. Actually, I'm not sure if okay, what I'm going to do is to do this. You're in on my Discord, right?
I am.
Can we end this call and then hop on into the voice channel in my Discord where we can bring him in, since it would be a third person?
Sure.
Or maybe I can just add him to the call. Let me try that real quick. I'm going to try that real quick, Real Altruist.
Should be able to.
Yeah, I think I should. I've never done that before. Let's see. Okay, there's Altruist, and invite to.
Oh, we lost each other. What's up, dudes? What's up, lecture fans, chat?
Can somebody tell me how to invite somebody into the call?
Well, I could do it. I don't think that okay. I'm not.
Oh, add friends. Oh, I see.
Yeah, select. There's a add button at the top of the screen. I don't know. I'm not friends with Real Altruist, sadly, on Discord.
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah.
Looks like your video is working on Discord now. You do have two cameras going.
Yeah, I do. I just didn't have it set up. Okay. Press Alt F4 to add new caller. Is that true? Is that quit? Which one is that?
That quits your program.
Okay.
Don't do that.
All right. Yeah. Don't. Come on, guys. I'm really slow on this stuff. So. Okay. All right. I guess nobody else in here seems to know how to do it. So. Yeah. I don't see the button. So.
We can go into your Discord.
All right. We'll do that. I'll see you there.
All right. See you. Yo.
Okay. Hey, Altrius and LCTRfan, we got you both here. Thank you both for putting up with my low-tier tech knowledge. What's a Discord? Someone mocking me in the chat. Whatever, folks. I do my best here. All right. So, Altrius, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, and thank you very much for taking the call. And LCTRfan, it's wonderful to see you as well. I've got my two favorite political streamers in one place.
Love it. Love it.
Wow. How about that?
Try much harder. You might break the internet.
Yep.
So my first question will be for LCTRfan, and I'm curious, LCTRfan, if you would be more accepting of a universal basic income program if the payments to recipients were restricted for certain types of expenses. So for instance, if they could not use the cash to purchase alcohol or drugs, but rather could use the cash to make a housing payment or a medical payment, would that make UBI a more suitable program for you?
I would say no, because that doesn't address the fundamental problem of UBI, which is that it's literally a government transfer payment scheme that doesn't do any benefits for the economy. And I think it's fundamentally unfair to take money from somebody and then give it to somebody, even if you're going to say you can't use it for drugs and alcohol. I mean, I think the fact that the Andrew Yang's proposal doesn't include
Bastiat,
that
can
limitation.
you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I hate to say this, but I just cannot hear a word that LCTRfan is saying.
Oh shoot.
Oh, really? Can you
yes,
hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you. I've got the yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. He's in there. Do you have yeah, I mean if
That's weird. You can hear Bastiat just fine?
It says that my user volume for him is at max and he's not muted.
If you can turn on the Bastiat bang on the side of it. Look, I know you guys are mocking me for this, but none of you have any solutions either here. Okay. And maybe if you can turn on the stream volume for him, you can
That's weird.
Yeah, that's weird because we're all talking in here. All the volume is fine. So so if you can turn on the stream volume for him, maybe you can hear his response. How about that?
How about I'll just wait for his response on the VOD and you just tell me when to ask your question.
Go ahead. You can go ahead. I basically finished my response.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, he's saying that, look, the problem with it is ultimately that it's a transfer of money, and that's fundamentally unfair. So you could put some strings on it, but that really doesn't make the program any better, right?
Correct.
Okay. So
I was gonna. My last point
That's
was
the LCTRfan answer that I was expecting.
My last point. Let me make one more point.
I would have one more question for you. Well, it might actually.
He's got one more point here. So what is your one
you're
more?
You're gonna have to convey this, I guess, to Real Altruist. Yeah. But my last point was going to be that I think the fact that Andrew Yang's proposal does not include any strings, such as that you can't use it for drugs and alcohol, makes it even less compelling than it already is to begin with. So the fact that it is missing that provision, I think, is a bad thing. But the fact that you would include that provision doesn't put it over the top.
I gotcha. So the lack of strings makes it worse. But even if you had the strings, that doesn't really. I mean, it's still a bad program. It's less bad somewhat, right, but it's still bad. So I mean, okay. So I got you. So thanks for your patience with that, folks. I mean, I really thought that the Discord call would work just fine because we've done these kinds of calls several times. So so next time I'll test it. We'll do the troubleshooting. We'll get the bugs out. But this is our first, although hopefully not last discussion like this, right, LCTRfan?
I agree. Yeah, no, I'm down. I was thinking earlier that if this goes well, then we'll have to keep doing them.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Altrius, what was your second question?
Well, okay, I have a question for you, and you have suggested that UBI would be a replacement for all social programs, I believe, with the exception of a universal health care policy. Would that be correct?
No, I think eventually maybe it would be nice to look at which other ones we could get rid of, but right now it's only a replacement for food stamps, WIC, and other programs like those. So
So
it's not a replacement for like disability, Social Security, or medical, programs.
no, I understand that, but
Yeah.
you would consider it a replacement for federal housing assistance, for instance?
That one, no, that one again is just because right now it's so like it's such a like in the long term it might be nice to do that, but at first I'm down with the Yang plan where we wouldn't get rid of that right away, because that one is just because of the problems that some localities have put on housing. In terms of like limiting how much of it you can build, if you eliminated the housing program overnight, a lot of people would be like wiped out. So I mean that's something you'd have to look at over a longer time frame. So yeah, like in that program, I don't believe is a direct cash transfer. That money goes straight to the landlord. It never goes through the LectureFan. Is that correct? That the housing programs, it doesn't go to the tenant. It goes to the landlord, right?
I don't know exactly how it
Yeah, I'm
works. I
pretty
think
sure. Like that,
yeah, I think that basically like you get a contract with HUD, and then you get like the Section 8 housing, and then like you get payments from HUD based on how many like low income people you have in your housing program. But no, so I don't think that
given an answer.
I don't think that Andrew Yang is actually calling for the elimination of food stamps in any way, shape, or form. I think what he's saying is that lots of people will get off of it because they'll voluntarily choose to do the $1,000 a month UBI. But I haven't seen anything where Andrew Yang is saying, hey, we're going to repeal various programs. I've never seen him call for any. I mean, maybe I haven't watched enough Andrew Yang speeches, but I've never heard of him calling for any elimination of. In fact, I've got an entire list here of massive amounts of additional programs on top of UBI. Like seriously, like an insane amount of additional programs.
Well, for what it's worth, I know LectureFan just said he's not sure that Andrew Yang has called for the removal of any programs. He has said that if you wanted to, and I know this because I asked him this question in person, ladies and gentlemen, nice. When I went to his rally in New Hampshire. He has said that some programs will remain, like the ones I listed, but food stamps and WIC would be gone because those are definitely cash transfer programs where you could replace those with the UBI. So those two are definitely gone, and then other ones analogous to it that I don't have on the tip of my tongue right now. But whereas other programs would not be. So, and other programs might be, to decide down the line. So he has said some programs you wouldn't necessarily eliminate them, though you would allow people to choose which one they want, and then eventually maybe over time, So, yeah, the Altruist though, I think that was the lead up to your question.
Yes, that was indeed the lead up to my question. So, it is a much more palatable program when you say that it gets rid of federal welfare.
Yeah.
But when we're all of a sudden talking about, it gets rid of a couple programs, it becomes a little less. I mean, why am I going to cut $300 in food stamps and then give somebody $1,000 a month? I mean, but anyway, I would like to use the food stamp program as the basis for my question to you.
Okay, sure.
And that is to say, we give people $1,000 a month and we expect them to use it responsibly. And we say, in exchange for giving you this $1,000 a month, we're going to cut off your federal food benefit program.
Right.
And let's say that, they're not responsible people and they blow the $1,000 a month on cocaine and hookers, which, probably won't go that far. But let's suggest that happens.
Sure.
Does the federal government now have a responsibility to see that these people are fed, or is the taxpayer done at that point? Can we put up our hands and say, you know what, no more? We told you the deal. You have to be responsible with the money. You weren't. And now there's no food assistance. Is that fair? Or are we just going to end up giving them their food stamps back anyway?
No, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, that's like saying right now, if you spend all your food stamps, you don't get any more until next month, So, I mean, it it would be analogous to that, I think. The one big advantage, though, over food stamps right now is that to the extent you do want people to spend the money on things they need, under UBI, you get $1,000 a month and you spend it on the things you need, right? And without any, I guess, without limitations, true, but also without losses. And when I say losses, I mean like food stamps right now. It's illegal to do this, but it happens all the time. People will take their food stamps and cash them in for cash with somebody.
Oh yeah, it's a whole industry.
Yeah, it's a whole industry, like LCTRfan just said. So you do eliminate problems like that. Because now, I mean, you've got the cash straight up. You can spend it on other things you need. I mean, and there are reasons why you could understandably need more for one thing this month than the other thing last month. I mean, right now it's a crime to try and turn your food stamps into liquid cash. But UBI comes with the advantage over that program of eliminating that problem. So if you need to spend more on food this month or less on food this month and more on your power bill, just as a simple example, it does come with that benefit. And to the extent that, I mean, that criminal activity goes on now, that would be squished out, except to the extent that some people would say, I don't want the $1,000 a month. I prefer my food stamps, which is, I feel like a pretty small amount of people would make that choice. So,
well, Bastiat, that nobody is getting $1,000 a month in food stamp benefits. So, of course, they're going to take the cash.
Sure.
And I think the problem here is that adults oftentimes come with children. And you can't take out the irresponsibility of the adult on the child. Mm-hmm. So if the adult blows all the money, society is going to have to come through and feed that family. And you get to this point where we have not eliminated a single federal benefit, and we've handed somebody an extra $1,000 a month. And I'm just wondering where the benefit for the public is there.
Well, I mean, in the scenario you've described, I guess I challenge the premise that responsibility is somehow greater under the current system than in this future system, like children's needs, for example. I mean, what you're saying is that we can guarantee that at least some of the money will be spent on food. I mean, if you remove food assistance and you give cash to people, I mean, they're not going to go without food every month. They've still got to spend some of that money on food. And to the extent that they're already not spending enough on their children's welfare with the programs we've got, I mean, I don't see how UBI really changes that situation, because you're right, it does give you more flexibility now. And I guess with that, the flexibility to spend it in different ways. But I mean, right now we do have, we do have the problem you're saying already with the existing program. So I guess I'm not sure that anybody like children, for example, would be put at risk, by this program, because the same people who are inclined not to help their children with their food stamps are probably already inclined to try and turn them into cash anyway. So,
yeah. So unfortunately, Bastiat, drugs and alcohol can be purchased with cash, and drugs and alcohol cannot be purchased with food stamps. So people are more responsible with their food stamps than they are with cash assistance.
But that's the thing. You can turn them into cash now. You're just doing so at a loss.
A substantial loss, which perhaps they do. But again, we're talking, an average food stamp benefit of what, $300 a month or something in this country.
Yeah.
A lot less opportunity for the money to be misspent. And I think you just underestimate the irresponsibility of people. There are many, many people that do not take care of their children. And if it weren't for food stamps, those kids wouldn't be getting fed.
Yeah. So, can I make a point?
Yeah, and LCTRfan is going to make a point here.
What you're saying is we just never will eliminate any federal program, and we'll give people an extra $1,000.
Well,
that seems hard for the average voter to swallow. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and end the call so I can get back on the stream and get into this response. Just one moment there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Altruist. Sorry about the technical difficulties here, and LCTRfan is going to have a response too.
Yeah,
Sorry about the
difficulties here,
I appreciate you putting up with it here. Yeah, so LCTRfan, please respond, and then I'll join in too.
No, so that's a bummer about the technical difficulties, because I was really looking forward to talking to Real Altruist, and I think that he makes a very good point, and I think his question to you was very well stated. I think it's a great point, a great question. I think it actually, what it made me think of, and the point that I wanted to make, is how it's so interesting, because with what, like, what we have now, we actually would consider that like fraudulent and abusive use of the food stamp program for you to advertise on Craigslist. Hey, I've got $200 in food stamps. If somebody will give me $100 in cash, I'll buy you $200 worth of food. And then to spend that $100 in cash on drugs and alcohol. So we would consider that fraud and abuse, right?
Yeah.
However, under UBI, we give them $1,000 and they go and they spend it all on drugs and alcohol. That's just fine. That's not fraud. That's not abuse. And so what we're doing is we're basically taking what we would be what we're taking fraudulent and abusive behavior and just making it okay. Like this, I never even thought of that until Real Altruist brought that up. But it's like this is not only making it okay for you to engage in behavior which we consider fraudulent and abusive behavior, which is to take taxpayer dollars and switch around to use it on drugs and alcohol, but we're actually encouraging it and saying it's okay to do that.
Well, now, I mean, it's not. Now, this is a point we probably disagree with on a lot of issues. I think just because the government says we're not going to punish you for this, isn't the government encouraging it? I mean, that's just the government being neutral on the issue. So I think there's a big difference between encouragement and an act of punishment. But on the other side of it too, there is something I think we're missing here, which is if you turn and again, it's not just food stamps that would be replaced. It would be other cash benefits too. If we're turning this money into something that you can spend on whatever purpose you want, then you still, even with the abusive parent in this situation, because they don't have to give up like 50 or 60% of the value of the food stamps to get the drugs that they want, they still will have more money left over to spend on other purposes. Maybe some of them will still consume yet more drugs and alcohol, which is a possibility. But in that situation, they've still got more money left to where they could spend it, say, on their children, rather than having to say, well, I've got to choose between my kids and my smack, and, I'm going to sell my food stamps to get the smack that I need. I mean, it just... Well, I think it's a minor issue, and I think it leaves people, still better off because they don't lose that kind of criminal premium share of the food stamps that they lose when they turn them into cash.
Well, I think the incentives that the government you create the incentives there by doing that, and so whether it's actively encouraging it or we're just moving from where we're discouraging something to no longer discouraging it, we go from discouraging something to being neutral on it. That's still movement towards increasing the incentive to engage in it. So I think the point still stands. But I was going to also say that human nature is such that if you actually have money that you've worked hard for, you're going to be more responsible with that than something that's given to you. And so the classic example of this is a kid that's just completely given a car. He gets his first car and his parents just gave him the car. These kids are rodding that thing and jumping it and treating it like shit and do. If they work all summer long, all 4 years of high school, they buy their first car, they treat that car much better. And this is true. That's human nature. That's true across all different things. And so you're actually like $1,000 that I toiled long hours all day long and I earned that $1,000. I'm going to be very much more responsible with that than $1,000 that's just given to me. That's just human nature. And so you're basically incentivizing and creating a situation where you're going to have irresponsible use of taxpayer dollars, period. And so frankly, I think like some of the regulations that we have on the current welfare programs that prevent use of taxpayer dollars for things like drugs and alcohol, I agree with that. Like, I don't think you should be getting government taxpayer funded if you're using it on drugs and alcohol. And so you're going to now eliminate that stipulation and it's going to, and it will result in more taxpayer dollars being used in irresponsible, inappropriate manner.
I mean, the argument that it would result in more being used, I mean, I just don't know. That's a big assertion. I mean, that's an assertion that is not borne out by the evidence of the studies that have been done on this so far, where people did not spend their money on drugs and alcohol. I mean, a couple people did on the edges, but most people spend it on things that they use to improve their lives. And so the idea that just that wide scale irresponsibility is an inevitable result here. I mean, I just think that kind of argument, that feels, sorry about the cat here. He really wants to get out of the room. That's a super, that feels like an anti-freedom argument to me generally. That's like saying we can't permit people to do various things because they'll do things in ways that are harmful to themselves and others. I can't accept that premise, because that premise rubs against like every tenet of our society. Like at our core, we think that if people are free to make their own decisions, they'll generally make the decisions that are best for them.
You've got it.
Therefore, generally best for society.
It's exactly, you've got it exactly backwards. Like we should make sure that government dollars are spent responsibly. Like when the government takes money from somebody, they have a huge responsibility to use that money responsibly and efficiently. And honestly, one of the main reasons that I'm against increasing taxes is because of the amount of waste that the government that occurs. And if the government was using our taxpayer dollars in a very responsible manner, and it was not being, there was no crony capitalism, there was no pork barrel spending, there was no insider deals, there was no corruption, all of this stuff, and we weren't wasting it on pointless things, and all of these horrible things are going, then okay, fine. Like maybe I'm down for, like, if we need more money for something that's a legitimate function of the federal government, you could convince me to increase a tax. But when there's so much waste, fraud, and abuse, the idea that we're going to we have no responsibility to the taxpayer to make sure that the money that we're taking from somebody that they worked hard and earned, and we're going to take that money from them, and then we're not going to use it responsibly, and then to try to use that as a freedom argument when literally the program is the opposite of freedom, because you're increasing taxes on people and eliminating their freedoms, I think is just it's totally backwards. It's 180 degrees out of phase.
See, I think that to me, I could see what you're saying, where you're saying an increase in taxes, an increase in freedom. Well, in some sense, no. Yeah, sure. Any increase in taxes is arguably a decrease in freedom in that sense. Sure. But what I'm arguing against is the idea that more strings attached on people's activity, that is a reduction on individual freedom. And the point of this program is to say, fundamentally, we think individuals can assess their needs better than the government can. Even individuals who are mired in poverty, right? They can assess their needs better than the federal government can. And therefore, we say, acknowledging the risk inherent in this, you spend the money however you see fit. Some people will spend it in ways that we regard as irresponsible. Other people will take risks with that money that might arguably be irresponsible, like investing in some kind of small business that they want to start up. Arguably, that's a risk that might never pay off, right? But it's also a risk that might pay off. And so the idea behind UBI is fundamentally to say, hey, look, use this money for the things you think are important in your life, and we trust you, the individual, to make this decision for yourself. And I do want to push back on one other point you made. You're saying that nobody takes care of property that's been given to them as well as they would take care of property that they earned, right?
Correct.
And I see what you're saying there, and I think there is something to that. But I think there's also something to the fact that once you get the UBI, it's your cash. It's your money at that point. And I do think that, as soon as you get that money, you regard it as yours. Certainly, I'm in line with Milton Friedman that, who proposed something like this, that nobody spends their money as careful. Nobody can spend the money of somebody else as carefully as they can spend that money, right? At this point, once the money hits their account, that's their money. And when the federal government is telling them what to use it on, that's the federal government spending it for them. So, I reject the premise that people will make worse decisions, because maybe some people will on the edges, but
okay,
the individual here has every incentive to make the best decisions they can.
Okay, to be fair to Milton Friedman, you can't really invoke him, given that the proposal on the table is nothing remotely like what Milton Friedman proposed.
Well, you're right, but it's different in some ways.
I object to that. I don't think Milton Friedman, there's no way he would support Andrew Yang's UBI proposal, so I don't think it's fair to invoke his name.
I think that it's different in some ways, in the sense that it doesn't eliminate the welfare programs he would want to eliminate. But the other premise you brought up is, that exists irrespective of which programs are eliminated. The idea that people will or will not make good decisions about their money. That's the only principle I'm invoking him on here. And I think that one is fair, because that problem exists irrespective of what other welfare programs you eliminate. So. Okay,
well, as long as we're talking about Milton Friedman, I got a Milton Friedman story because I knew that Milton Friedman was going to come up.
Let's do it. So let me just open the door for this cat real quick. One second.
All right. Well, do you want me to talk while you're gone?
Because they won't.
All right.
They won't stop with the. Sorry about that. kind of unprofessional, but these cats, this is national live
No.
Twitch TV. These cats wouldn't shut up.
This is national Twitch TV. Okay, so one time Milton Friedman was visiting a foreign country, and they were building a canal. And he saw, hey, everybody was digging in this canal with shovels. And so Milton Friedman asked this government bureaucrat, he said, hey, why are you guys using shovels to dig this canal? Why don't you get like a backhoe or a machine or something? And the government bureaucrat said, this is a jobs program. And so Milton Friedman said, well, why not give them spoons?
Yeah. Then you can employ everybody. Oh, yeah. No, I
right,
love
and so isn't that a great one?
It's a great one because whenever I hear about that federal jobs guarantee that Bernie supporters talk about, that's like, that's the kind of planning you can expect.
Yeah. So the other thing though that I think Milton Friedman would strenuously object to with respect to Andrew Yang is not only that he doesn't get rid of all of the welfare programs, that this is a thing on top of all the welfare, but he also, Andrew Yang also doesn't address the problem that most of our labor problems, including stagnant wages and things like that, are the result of government. And so government regulations create friction in the job market. Minimum wage makes it more difficult for people to get jobs, more entry-level jobs. It makes it more difficult for people to learn new skills on the job. Occupational licensing laws are a huge harm on low-income entry-level workers. Government sponsored labor unions, various labor laws and labor regulations that drive up the cost of employment. And so all of these things, incidentally, this is really ironic, but all of these things actually, in the minimum wage, of course, is one of the big ones too. All of these things drive automation, and they drive robots and machines. And so if an employer is looking at it and they got, okay, well, I've got a minimum wage, I've got a government sponsored or government promoted labor union, I've got all these occupational licensing laws that I've got to pay for my employees to keep up. I've got numerous labor laws that I could be sued for or subject to administrative proceedings on, or I could I could buy a computer. Yeah. And so like literally a lot of these things that Yang is talking about and supports and is not calling for the elimination of, not just the welfare program, are actually increasing automation and stuff. And those issues that I just talked about, Milton Friedman would be in favor of getting rid of. So I think that's another important point.
I agree that this does not solve everything for sure. And I mean, just to pick out one that you mentioned, occupational licensing restrictions. Yeah, I would love to get rid of most of those. Nice. Including maybe even some of the ones that we benefit from. Oof, although that, of course, is a very difficult
officers of the court? Oof.
Well, no, I mean, you don't have to get rid of all of them, but maybe some of them. Like, for example, the fact that you can't cross state lines in most states. Now, I mean, I don't know what Montana is like, but there are some states, including my state, that you can't cross any. You get, once you leave the state, you're basically no longer a lawyer.
No, I've got a Florida license.
Serious, Oh, cool.
I've got a Florida license. I went to University of Miami, and I know it really bugged me because Florida, their bar is extremely restrictive because they don't want all the New Yorkers that are coming down to Florida just immediately practicing law there. And so it was a pain because I've got 3 licenses in 3 different states and I had to take 3 different bar exams because Florida has zero reciprocity with anybody.
Yeah, and that kind of protection, I don't see how that helps the public at all. I mean, it just seems to serve to inflate the prices of Florida lawyers.
I mean, it's a cartel basically.
So I mean, I am down with a lot of scaling a lot of that back. I mean, and maybe this is a case-by-case situation, but you could argue that UBI opens up new possibilities. Like maybe you wouldn't have to increase the minimum wage much anymore because people would have some bargaining power by being able to say, look, I'll just leave, and leaving is not such a devastating process anymore because you have some cushion, to fall back on. So, I mean, you could argue that some of these other programs could be modified somewhat. And there are other programs that maybe it has no impact on, like the occupational licensing issue. I mean, those should certainly be re-examined I definitely, I mean, we were having a discussion the other night on our stream where we were doing one of those political compass tests. And, there was a question of professional licensing. And I was really struggling over the issue of whether or not I want to have professional licensing of like pilots and doctors and lawyers. And I was like, no, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to be consistent here. Yeah, we should get rid of it for the hairdressers. Yeah, we should get rid of it for other people. But maybe, where do you draw the line? So, I mean, that's a discussion we need to have in this country, because right now there's way too much of it.
There is. I mean, I think, okay, so I mean, I think there is legitimate occupational licensings that deal with the genuine health and safety, and so the entire basis for all occupational licensings is health and safety, right? I mean, that's the entire, like, if you go to, actually, I worked for the Institute for Justice, which is a public interest law firm that challenges occupational licensing laws on constitutional grounds, and they're always subject to rational basis review. And so it's really easy. And these are like you have to have a cosmetology license to do eyebrow threading, and that was one of the lawsuits they filed because, and they were literally saying this was not even rationally related, because you had to go to school to learn all of these different schools, like 2,000 hours of schooling and all these different fees that have literally no rational relationship to like eyebrow threading. And so there's so many, like beekeeping, you have to be licensed to be a beekeeper in Florida, and like it's just like insanity, so on and on and on and on and on. But I think, like, for doctors and lawyers and pilots, like, we don't have to start there. It's like we can start with other occupational licensing laws, but the point is that it's another government regulation that harms the labor market and that Andrew Yang doesn't want to get rid of.
Oh, well, now, I mean, I'm not sure what his position is on occupational licensing. I mean, I usually we're focused on his three big flagships are the Medicare for All, the UBI, and the Democracy Dollars ones. And then he does have a bunch of other ones. He's got so many that I'm certainly not well versed in all of them. So I don't know what his stance is on occupational licensing. He's probably said something about it at this point, because he said something about so much. But I'm certainly with you that we need to reexamine some of that. I mean, to me, it seems like state level protectionism, because the Constitution, right, doesn't allow you to do that, up front and honestly. You can't have a tariff on foreign, or as in from other states in the United States, foreign labor and foreign goods, but you can use health and safety, right? And then that's been used as a way to kind of backhandedly put tariffs and labor controls in place,
Right.
So I'm down. That stuff needs to be reexamined, and maybe one of these days maybe for one of our next talks like this, we can figure out where to draw the line. Although that one may not be so interesting, because I imagine we agree on a lot of that.
Yeah, no, that's great that we agree on that.
Yeah. I mean, other things that he wanted to do. He had Milton Friedman, that is, had an idea to have. I mean, how do you feel about tariffs usually? Are you usually against those?
I am generally against tariffs, except for, frankly, like, I think if we could fund the entire federal government with tariffs like we did for the first 100 and some odd years, like we didn't even have a federal income tax until 1913, 1914. And so if we got rid of the federal income tax, I would be okay with replacing some of that income with tariffs. The second way I think they're okay is a way to negotiate trade deals. And so I don't think that we should allow companies or countries access to our markets if they don't provide reciprocal trade deals. And so that's why I 100% support Trump's tariffs, and not for the sake of tariffs, like Trump likes tariffs for the sake of tariffs. I like tariffs as a negotiating tool in trade negotiations. I do not like tariffs for the purpose of protecting a domestic industry. So I think when you talk about tariffs, you have to talk about what's the purpose, why are you doing them?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, definitely the purpose is worth considering, but in the past, when we funded the federal government with tariffs, I mean, that was basically a giveaway to domestic industry. And I mean, so I'm down. I mean, I understand Trump's thinking in the short term of like using them as negotiating chips, but in the long term, they just always seem to amount to another form of taxation. And like, one of the things I don't like is that he frames it as though the Chinese are paying these taxes. It's good looking.
Well,
shirt.
hold on. That's
them is like taxes that the Chinese are paying, but we're paying these tariffs.
We're not though. No. So I know that I know functionally how it works is that the American person or business buying the good has to pay that tariff. I know that that's how it works. But in reality, in practical reality, all of these Chinese companies that are selling to the United States are subsidized by the Chinese government. And so what the Chinese government does is the Chinese government subsidizes those companies. And so when Trump put a 10% tax on certain Chinese goods, the Chinese government immediately subsidized their companies, and those companies were then allowed to or able to reduce the price of their goods such that even with Americans paying that 10% price, the actual price of the good remained the same. So that's the one. That's the one way that there's a second one too, which is that China has devalued its currency as well, and so both subsidizing domestic industries that are subject to American tariffs and devaluing their currencies means that in practical effect, China is paying the tariffs. But I get like how tariffs work, that obviously it's Americans that pay them, but when you actually look at the way that they're subsidizing them and devaluing their currency, it really is. And obviously that can only go so far. At some point, China will stop doing that. But as it stands now, like that's like what's crazy. Like you've actually seen all of these tariffs go on all of these goods, but we actually haven't seen a price increase.
That's interesting.
And that's from the Chinese government subsidizing those companies, because there's hardly any Chinese companies that are not intimately tied in with the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I'm down with that. I mean, that's true. Now, if I would want to look that up, but I mean, if that's right, then I can see how he can say that with a somewhat straight face. I mean, it's still a tax, but I see what you're saying. They, I mean, I just in the long term, I would want to get rid of them, with the one exception maybe of there might be some case that China is just such a unique threat, like a USSR of the 21st century, that, to the extent we use tariffs for foreign policy purposes, maybe that's an example of it. But otherwise, I'd like to get rid of them all. Actually, one issue that people have been dropping in the chat here that might be worth discussing sometime would be immigration.
I had somebody in my chat. Somebody in my chat was saying, please make the next one illegal immigration, open borders, or legal immigration. So we should. Yeah,
we can do that sometime.
We should probably wrap this one up, but.
Yeah. But that's one that I think would be fun, and we can plan that out, whether it be next
for
week
sure.
or farther out or something. Because that's one that I talk about a lot, and it's always interesting. Everybody always calls me an extremist on it. So
nice. Yeah, no, that would be a fun one. I mean, I think it's one of the most important political issues in the United States. It's one of the reasons Trump won. And it certainly is a top issue in terms of when Americans are polled and they're asked, what is your most important issue? It's usually the economy and immigration.
Yeah. So it's interesting stuff.
But man,
do you have anything else you would? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say almost 2.5 hours on UBI. That was nice of Real Altruist to come in and give us a little bit more content there. Yeah. So.
That was. Thank you so much, Real Altruist. And next time we'll have all the technical side of this worked out. So, LectureFan, I know we've got a bunch of people listening now. Before we tie this up, is there anything else you'd like to say on the subject, or you'd like to say to everybody else who's listening?
Am I allowed to say free Hong Kong on your stream?
Yeah, obviously we're on the same page there. I got a Hong Kong flag pin coming. I'm very excited for that.
Oh, that's awesome.
I just think
nice.
It'd be fun to do like a I was thinking that's like my contribute to the cause of freedom, the flag pin. I was thinking it would be cool to do a fundraiser sometime for Hong Kong, like on Twitch. I've seen a lot of more left-leaning people do fundraisers for various causes, and I was thinking it would be cool to do some kind of fundraiser for the protesters in Hong Kong, but I'm not sure who to donate to. So maybe we could figure that out sometime, because I think that would be popular. I mean, I imagine a lot of people in the chat in both of our chats would be interested in something like that. And I just haven't been able to figure out like who we would give money to and how we would get it there. So I'd be open to that. Maybe we could figure out how to do something like that sometime.
That's a great idea. That could be big news if you pull that off. Yeah.
So, but definitely free Hong Kong. That's a good point to go out on.
Yep. No, I really enjoyed it. We'll definitely do it again. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Likewise, buddy. Have a good night. Thanks again for for the 2.5 hours of your time, everybody. That was
Yep.
LectureFan, and that was a lot of fun. Have a good night, man.
Cool. See ya. Bye.